It's no secret that the Sicilian defense is the most aggressive way to respond to e4. Today I'm going to be showing you the Khan variation of the Sicilian defense, and I want to show you guys some variations that we're going to be looking on. So for example, whenever they play knight f3, we're going to be playing the move pawn to e6, and then after pawn d4, we take knight takes, then play pawn a6. And from this position, there's so many ways in which white could lose. The first way in which white could lose is he could play a regular natural developing move like bishop to f4. And this is losing because we're actually able to win the game by playing the move pawn to e5, forking both the knights and the bishop. And if he ever takes on e5, we give a check, check the king. Once he blocks the check, we take the bishop, we win the game. Now, a lot of your opponents are going to be playing the Italian game. And let's say you're playing the Sicilian Khan, they go bishop c4. We just need to play pawn a6. And let's say they just castle their king. We can actually start our attack with moves like pawn to b5. And already, white has to be very careful. For example, anytime you see someone pulls the bishop back to b3, just remember that a move like pawn c4 traps the bishop and you win the bishop. Another main component of the Sicilian Khan, let's say they go knight f3, pawn e6, pawn d4, takes, pawn a6. Whenever the knight goes to c3, the move that I want you guys to play is queen to c7. Now, here's the whole idea of queen to c7. Let's say they play a regular move like bishop to e3. We're going to start an attack on their center and their knight. So it's usually best to start off with something like knight to f6, applying a lot of pressure to the pawn. Let's say they play queen d2, trying to castle their king. Now you can play something like bishop to b4. And bishop to b4 can be played whether they play queen to d2 or not. So if they castle the king, we're actually already winning if we play a move like knight takes e4 because we're hitting the queen. The knight is not able to move. If he moves the knight, we simply take the queen. Even if he plays a move like pawn to a3 to attack our bishop, we're still able to play the move knight takes e4, which hits the queen. He's going to be forced to move the queen somewhere, and then we just take on c3, and this is already just completely winning. Now, let me show you guys one more line. This is actually perfect against Italian players. Let's say you play e6, they play bishop c4, you play a6, the regular stuff. They decide to castle the king, we put the queen on c7, and to continue with their development, let's say they go knight c3. Here we could play moves like knight c6, developing normally, pawn d3, they're trying to develop. We play something like knight to f6, and there's actually some very cool, aggressive attacking ideas here. For example, there's actually a lot of traps. For example, let's say the queen move, you could actually play knight g4, and there's two ways to react to moves like pawn to h3. The first thing is if they try to play pawn h3 and you're able to put your knight on d4, especially if you're attacking the queen, this is completely losing because not only are you attacking the queen, if the knight takes on d4, queen h2 is going to be a checkmate. If the queen decides to move, we eliminate the knight, then we deliver the checkmate. Now, what if, let's say you're in a position like this, and then you decide to play, let's say the queen does not go to e2, and let's say he plays a random move, you put your knight on g4, then he decides to play pawn h3. You could actually get away with pawn to h5. This is like the fishing pole 2.0, because if they take, we're just going to take back, and this is already winning for black. The knight is not able to move. And if your opponent still decides to move the knight, queen to h2 is just going to be a checkmate. These are the lines that I'm going to be showing you guys today. I'm going to be showing it from 500 all the way to 2000. Watch the full video. Go play some games with this opening, and your ratings will go through the roof. Kicking things off in the 500 region, the opponent plays e4. Let's play pawn c5. We're going to be playing the Sicilian Khan. It's a setup that can be played against any way they play e4. For example, this is the Alpine variation of the Sicilian, and we're going to start by playing the move pawn to e6, followed by pawn to a6. Our queen will be going to the c7 square. Now, bishop to c4 was played. Usually the purpose of c3 is to play d4. So let's just play the move queen to c7. putting the queen on the same line as the bishop, and our pawn is going to be going to a6. That's the whole Sicilian can setup. So knight f3 was played. We play pawn a6. Now we're able to play pawn to b5 in the future. And then from here, it's going to be very regular development of our pieces. The opponent decided to castle the king, and here I'm just going to finish my development. I'm going to start by playing the move knight c6. This knight is going to be going to f6. We're still going to be playing moves like pawn to b5. We're going to be putting our bishop on b7, pointing towards the opponent's king. And we're already going to be going for some very aggressive attacking ideas on the king. So pawn to d3 was played. The opponent is developing the pieces very normally, like some Italian type of setup. Let's play the move knight to f6. And the reason why I played knight c6 before knight to f6 is so that way I'm not too afraid of a move like pawn to e5, because now I'm covering the square two times. He's only guarding it once. Okay. The opponent played bishop to f4. I mean, this is 500, so I'm not expecting to see any perfect chess at the 500 level. But that is a free bishop, you know. So let's just take the bishop. Um, that's another good reason why the queen is good on c7. You know, it prevents the bishop from going to f4, but I actually wanted to set up like a very aggressive attack on the opponent's king that I showed you guys in the intro, where the knight goes to g4, the pawn goes to h5, and then we could go knight e5 to chase away this knight. But the opponent is just making it way easier for us. So knight d2 was played, and I'm thinking if I should still go for the idea, but it's the position is just winning regardless of what I play. I'm gonna still go for the idea. Let's play pawn to h5 because I want to at least show you guys what I'm trying to go for. I want to put my knight on g4. So pawn to g3 was played. My queen is under attack, so we have to pull it back to c7. And one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind is whenever they play pawn to g3, it still invites us to play pawn to h4. Maybe not now, but sometimes in the future, because it creates something that is called a hook, which means the moment we move the pawn to h4, our h rook is going to be open. Now the opponent plays the move knight to h4, you know, putting the knight on the edge of the board. That's also not needed. There's a lot of stuff that I could continue here. I mean, I could just finish my development. Let's just play pawn to b5. And a lot of times when you're playing the Khan, you're going to be moving your b pawn so that way your bishop on c8 goes to b7. That way it really points towards the opponent's king. The bishop went back to b3. Let's now just put this bishop on this open Well, the diagonal is not necessarily open, seeing that his pawn is there. But in the future, we could think about playing moves like pawn to d5 or even pawn to f5 to open the diagonal. Now that the opponent plays the move queen to f3, this knight is no longer able to be pulled back to f3. So I'm going to go ahead and play the move knight to e5, hitting the queen, forcing the queen to move. My knight is also applying a lot of pressure to this d3 pawn. Queen to f4 was played. That's an interesting decision. The opponent is basically putting the queen on the same diagonal as my queen. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to play the move bishop to d6, putting my bishop on the same diagonal as their queen, which means once I move my knight out the way, it really doesn't matter where I put my knight. The queen on f4 will be under attack. And this is going to be called a discovered attack. Queen to g4 was played. That's an interesting move because my pawn on g7 is unprotected. And I don't really think there's a huge threat that is in my position here. Like, I could actually just go ahead and play king to f8. Like, I don't want to castle because I want to use this rook in the attack. But once I play king to f8, I guard the pawn. I'm not able to play knight f3 fork, by the way, because the square is being guarded by knight. So if I put my knight on f3, you know, the knight is just going to tick. Now that rook to c1 was played, that's just blundering a pawn because my knight was attacking the unprotected pawn. So let's just take the pawn on d3, attacking the rook. And now I'm thinking about moves like pawn to c4, attacking the bishop. I'm also thinking about moves like knight takes e4, just taking a free pawn on e4. Because I'm attacking the pawn two times, the opponent is only guarding it once. Okay, now I just don't know what my opponent is doing, to be honest. Like knight to g6. Maybe they think it's a fork, but my pawn is hiding behind my knight, so that's just a free knight. Not sure what's happening. And Because the knight is no longer on h4, it's also allowing me to play moves like pawn to h4 and just tap the pawn on g3. So rook to c2, the opponent decided to save the rook, and pawn to h4 is a very nice move, but pawn to c4 actually traps the bishop because now the bishop is not able to go back. The bishop has nowhere to go, which means I'm just going to be taking the bishop on the next move, depending on what he does. He decided to sacrifice his knight, so let's just take the free knight. Now the bishop gets access to the a4 square, but the pawn on e4 is now just completely unprotected, and my knight will be able to just grab the free pawn. So I'm thinking about this. Let's grab the free pawn, attacking the queen. I'm assuming he's going to play queen takes g6 and capture a free pawn, but that's actually a huge mistake because the queen is going to be trapped. So I want you guys to notice how all my pieces point towards the opponent's king. So when we start playing persons stronger than this, you're going to be seeing how my pieces pointing towards the opponent's king will generate the attack. Now that the queen takes on g6, the game is basically over because his queen is just trapped. To win the queen, I just need to play the move rook to h6. The queen has no safe squares to go. Anywhere the queen goes, I'm just going to capture it. So I'm assuming he's going to just try to capture the more valuable piece, which is my rook. And then I'm just going to take back and then just deliver a checkmate in the next two moves. So he sacked the queen. Let's just take the queen. And because of this very strong bishop on the diagonal, I was just about to say that I'm going to be delivering a checkmate like this. But he did decide to play the move pawn to f3, which is attacking my knight. So still have to be a bit careful here. Knight to g4 will not lead to an immediate checkmate. I'm thinking of sacrificing on g3. Like if I takes, he's gonna take with check though. So let's just play knight to g4. I'm still trying to deliver a checkmate on the h3 square. It's only gonna be a checkmate if my bishop covers these light squares. So if he plays pawn to f4, it's gonna be a checkmate. Otherwise, I'm gonna try to set up the checkmate by maybe bringing my queen into the attack. Well, the opponent did decide to play pawn to f4, which means that's just checkmate. More Sicilian can against 600 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 600. We're still going to be playing the Sicilian can. And as we said, once they make their move, we're going to play the move pawn to c6, well, pawn to e6, pawn to d4. This is what strong players play. This guy's 600 playing pawn to d4, so that's very commendable. But let's take on d4 in this position. And then once the knight takes, as I said before, we're going to play the move pawn to a6. This is the start of the can variation of the Sicilian defense. Now, knight c3, this is all theoretically correct move that this guy's playing. We're going to put the queen on c7, applying pressure to the knight. The bishop could go to b4 and pin the knight. And queen to c7 is so that way the pawn is not easily moved to e5 because of a fork that we have. So he decides to play bishop to e3. This is actually one of the main ways in which white could make mistakes, by the way, because even though bishop e3 seems to be a normal development move, it's going to be very easier for me to apply a lot of pressure to the knight on c3 or to the pawn on e4. So I'm just going to be playing normal development move here. This is what we discussed. I'm going to be applying pressure to the pawn, and then once he makes his next move, hit him with bishop b4, and black is actually going to be better coming out of the opening. Bishop to d3 now, he's trying to develop very normally, but now I'm going to go bishop to b4. I already have two pieces applying pressure to his knight on c3, and I'm assuming he's going to try to defend it. Like queen to d2 should be bad due to pawn c5. If he pulls the bishop back to d2, then he's moving the same piece more than once in the opening. So, I mean, there's also knight back to e2. I've seen persons try knight back to e2, but I'm playing principled moves. He's moving the same piece more than once in the opening. I could live with that. So from here, let's continue with the regular Sicilian can idea. We're going to play the move pawn to b5. Pawn to b5 has a lot of reasons. For one, it allows us to put our bishop on this very long diagonal, applying pressure to the pawn on e4, applying pressure to his pawn on g2 once his king is castled. And in a lot of cases, it allows us to play pawn to b4, chasing away this knight on c3, so that way we're able to win the pawn on e4. Pawn to a3 was played. No, I'm not going to take on c3 because, he guarded the knight. I'm not going to be winning any material. So I'm just going to move my bishop to safety here. So let's just pull the bishop back to c5, attacking the knight. Usually when bishop c5 is played, the knight goes back to b3 to attack the bishop. Then we pull the bishop back to e7. So basically, you could say the bishop belongs on e7 and the knight belongs in the center of the board. But we don't really want him to keep the knight in the center of the board. Bishop e3 was played, not bad. Guy's playing very well for 600, by the way. Let's fianchetto our bishop. Now we have two pieces attacking his e4 pawn. He also has two pieces guarding the pawn. So, he's not about to lose any material or anything. And then once the opponents castle their king, there's a very thematic attacking plan that I want all of you guys to use when you're playing the Sicilian can, and it's this move pawn to h5. Now, the regular thing is just to get the king out the center of the board, which is fine. But once you play pawn to h5, you're actually threatening to play knight g4, which is a checkmating threat. And it's not one of those fingers crossed type of checkmating threat where you're like, if he doesn't see the checkmate, then he's going to get checkmated. The whole idea is to force him to be moving pawns on the side that his king is on. So now that he plays pawn b4, I mean, that's already a blunder. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The guy's about to lose a piece. Now, it's a bit deep. If you're able to find it, that's good. But first, I'm going to play the move knight g4, threatening a checkmate. I want you to notice how the drawback of moving the pawn to b4 is the fact that it was protecting this knight. And my queen is on the same line as the knight, which means once I move this bishop out the way, his knight is going to be under attack. But I have to be a bit slick on how I do it. For example, once he plays pawn g3, I mean, that's the only move that guards the mate. He's 600, but I'm not assuming he's going to just blunder a mate. So once he plays pawn g3, first, I need to eliminate the bishop so that way once I take the bishop doesn't take and guard the knight. Once I eliminate the bishop, you could say it's a removing the guard tactic. The pawn is going to be forced to take. Then I take on d4. And then the pawn is going to be forced to take again. Then I take on c3. And I'm going to be ahead by a piece, 13 moves into the Sicilian can. So let's go for this idea. Let's take on e3 first. It comes with a fork, so he has to take. And then once he takes, we take on d4. I'm threatening e3. I'm still threatening the knight, so he still has to take. And then once he takes, we take a free knight, and we're just completely winning. So he took. Let's take the knight. Now that we're ahead by a piece, the goal from here is simply get some pieces developed, ensure that we do not get checkmated. For example, if he plays a move like queen to f3, we just need to be a bit careful. But he would be putting the queen on the same diagonal as the bishop, which means pawn to f5 is just going to be a very strong move there. All right, so he decided to pull the bishop back because I was attacking his pawn on d4, but we spoke about how the drawback principle works. I guess he didn't see that the bishop was guarding the pawn on e4. So now I'm able to just take the pawn on e4, and that's just another free pawn. And then once I play the move knight c6, I'm going to have two pieces attacking his pawn on d4. So, this position is now just completely winning, especially if he takes on h5. Like, he has two pieces hovering h5, but taking on h5 is just bad, bro. Because now I'm able to play g6, and okay, maybe he thinks I'm only chasing away his bishop, but now my rook has an open file pointing towards his king. And there could be some very nasty tactical ideas that comes. Okay, I'm going to sack my rook. Remember that I told you guys I'm going to sack my rook. Just watch what's about to hit him. No, I'm not going to sack my rook. I'm going to sack my queen. Yo, I'm going to sack my queen. Okay, I'm not gonna be sacrificing anything. He saw exactly what was about to hit him. If he had pulled the bishop back, I would have actually sacrificed my queen and checkmate him. But he decides to move the rook to e1, which is not bad because it covers the e3 square, which means once I take his bishop, he's going to want to take my bishop. But what if I just pull the bishop back though? Like, this makes it easier for me, no? Just pull the bishop back. Because now if I pull the bishop back, his bishop is actually still under attack. So I'm assuming he's going to have to play bishop to g4, which is losing. If he pulls the bishop back to e2, then that's actually going to be a checkmate. So let's see what he does. So he pulls the bishop on g4. I'm trying to give a check on e3. If I'm able to check on e3, it's going to be gg. So let's play pawn to f5 here, attacking the bishop again. If the bishop goes back, okay, that's a free bishop. If the bishop goes here, that's a free bishop. And if the bishop goes to e2, then he's going to be getting checkmated with queen to e3 check. So what is there to do here? He did pull the bishop back to e2, my fellow viewers. And How I'm gonna deliver this checkmate is I'm going to start by playing queen to e3 check. The king just has nowhere to go, so it has to go to f1. Then I'm going to take on h2, and there's nothing he's going to be able to do to prevent queen to f2 checkmate. So let's hit him with queen to e3. The king has to go to f1. He moves the king to f1. Now we take on h2, and there's just nothing he could play to prevent my queen from going to f2 and deliver a checkmate. He moves the bishop to f3, but that's just a checkmate. More Sicilian can against 700 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 700. Plays e4. Let's play pawn c5. This is the Sicilian defense, and we're trying to do the Sicilian can. He plays knight to f3. We're going to be playing the move pawn to e6, followed by pawn a6. He plays immediate pawn to d4. We don't really see this at the lower levels, but let's take on d4. Assuming he's going to play knight takes d4, then I play pawn to a6. So the plan from here is simple. Okay, this is like one of the main traps in the Sicilian can. Like moving the pawn to e5 too early is not really good because the pawn on e5 is unprotected. The king is exposed. I'm able to simply play the move queen to a5, which checks the king and hit the pawn at the same time. So we're already ahead by a pawn and we're 5 moves into the game. So he decides to block with the knight. Let's take on e5 with check. So he has to block the check. Not sure how he's going to block. I mean, he could decide to block with either of his bishops. Both of them is going to be fine moves. And then from here, I'm just going to continue with my development. So he decides to block with the e2 bishop. Again, it's a fine move. Let's just develop my knight to f6. And then he pulls the knight back to f3, which means my queen is now under attack. So let's just pull the queen back to c7. I mean, that's where the queen belongs anyways. Pawn is going to b5, knight is going to c6. And if he decides to castle his king, which he did, as we discussed, we could try the whole knight g4, pawn h5 idea. But we don't really have enough pieces developed just yet. So let's play pawn to b5 first, at least try to ensure that we're developing the light squared bishop. So that way, if we play knight g4, we immediately threaten to eliminate the knight and then checkmate on h2. He decides to play the move pawn a3, which prevents my pawn from going to b4. Let's just play bishop b7, and already we're applying pressure to his knight, which is the main defender of the h2 square, which means all we need to do from here is apply some pressure to his h2 pawn, and we could be seeing the thematic removing the guard type of checkmates that I discussed in the intro. Okay, he decides to play the move pawn to g3, which means my knight is not necessarily going to be going to the g4 square anymore. But what I am going to do is play the move pawn to h5 because now I'm trying to play pawn h4. If I'm able to play something like pawn h4 and just open the file for my rook, I'm going to be getting a lot of activity. Now that his bishop is on f4, which is attacking my queen, I'm actually going to put the queen on c6. Notice where my queen is. The queen is pointing towards his h1 and his g1 square, which means this knight is not going anywhere. Okay, I wasn't expecting him to take mine. That was such a bad move because my knight on b8 wasn't even getting developed. I mean, let's just take on b8. Not sure what he's doing, but I'm still going to play the move pawn to h4. If he takes with the pawn, I should be able to sack my rook because his knight is not really doing anything. But then he decides to play pawn h4, and things is about to get very interesting. There's a lot of ways to do it. I'm thinking of immediate g5. If he takes with the knight, then he gets mate. If he takes with the pawn attacking my knight, I don't move the knight, I play h4. And then if he takes my knight, I take on g3. Let's just develop first. Let me finish my develop. Let me try to be at least a bit principled. Now, I want you guys to notice how my pieces are pointing towards the opponent's king. Because I have so many pieces pointing towards the opponent's king, there's going to be some nasty ideas. For example, I was thinking about playing moves like queen c7 taking on g6, but he moves his king off the same diagonal as my bishop. But now I'm able to play knight g4, checking his king. And not only am I checking his king, I'm also attacking his f2 pawn. So, damn, the guy plays king to h3. I wasn't even expecting that move. So there's actually a lot of ways to win. There's knight e5, and if he takes queen g2 is mate. If I go knight e5, he has to play king g2. But because I have two pieces attacking the f2 pawn and he only has his rook guarding, let's just fork him on f2. I mean, he has to sacrifice his rook. We take the rook, and I don't need more than this to win the game. We're already ahead by an exchange. He still decides to play the move knight e5. These are the attacking positions that you're going to be getting if you play the Sicilian can. And now that my queen is under attack, I'm just going to move my queen. But nah, that was just a trick. Queen g2 is just a checkmate. More Sicilian defense against 800 level players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 800. Started off with e4. Let's play c5, the Sicilian defense. And after knight f3, we're going to play the move pawn to e6, because we're trying to play pawn e6, queen c7, just a regular Sicilian can. Let's see what he does here. On d4 was played. This is what the high-rated guys play. Let's take on d4. And once the knight takes, we play the move pawn to a6, so that way a piece is not able to get to the b5 square because we're trying to put our queen on the c7 square. So he decides to play the move pawn to g3. And that's an interesting move. Whenever they play pawn to g3, well, first we're going to be developing our pieces. So let's put the queen on c7. And my plan from here is to put my bishop on b7. Okay, now he plays a3. Definitely an unnecessary pawn move. I guess he's trying to play knight c3 and he doesn't want me to pin, but let's now play pawn to b5. My plan from here is to play bishop b7 and tag this pawn on e4. So he plays bishop to g2 to guard it. Let's fianchetto the bishop. Now I have some attack on his e4 pawn. And what I wanted to tell you guys is the move pawn to h5. Whenever they play pawn to g3 trying to fianchetto their king and trying to keep their king safe, you could actually play pawn h5 followed by pawn h4. It's going to help us to open more lines pointing towards the opponent's king. Or they could blunder with moves like bishop f4. This is actually something that is similar to what we discussed in the intro, but bishop to f4 is just a blunder because now I'm able to play pawn to e5. And usually bishop to f4 is not bad if the bishop is able to go back to g3, but because he plays pawn g3, this is now just a fork. I'm 8 moves into the opening. I'm about to win a piece. If he moves the bishop, I take the knight. If he moves the knight, I take the bishop. So he decides to move the knight. Let's just get the bishop out of the way. And we're already ahead by a piece. So from here, it's just regular, normal development. Let me start by developing my knight. I'm now attacking the pawn on e4 twice. He's only guarding it once. But okay, he plays knight d2. He's now guarding it twice. But I'm still trying to ensure that I finish my development. So let's go bishop c5. And once I play something like knight c6, all my minor pieces are going to be developed. So he decides to castle his king. Let's play knight c6, castle the king on the king side, and then all my pieces are going to be developed and safe. Now, the plan was to play h5, h4, and then start an attack that way. But I'm honestly thinking that I don't need to do something like that. Okay, now that he plays rook e1, can I play h5 and then if e5 I go knight g4? So I wasn't well, but he's also trying to play knight d5, which will bring a lot of drama. So let's just get our king out the center of the board. We won the piece, so because we won the piece, we don't really need to be complicating the game. Like his f2 pawn is weak. I was planning on playing queen to b6 to attack f2. He decides to play b4 to attack the bishop, and I'm gonna play bishop to d4 here and attack his rook. I'm gonna be forcing him to move the rook, and then once he moves the rook, I'm thinking of moves like knight e5 to centralize my knight. Okay, there's so many ways to win this. Like bishop b2 is winning. Knight e5 is fine. Just rook to e1, getting my rook in the game is fine. But let's go with a fork. The pawn is unprotected. The rook is on a dark square. Let's play bishop b2 and attack the rook. He's now forced to move the rook. I mean, if he doesn't move the rook, he's gonna lose the rook. Once the rook moves, we take the pawn on a3. And if he loses the a3 pawn and he's not careful, he could also lose his b4 pawn. So let's take on a3. I'm now attacking the b4 pawn twice. He's only guarding the b4 pawn once. So he has to play something like pawn c3, which he did play. Now I have to be careful not to get my bishop trapped, but I'm just going to play pawn to a5 in this position. If he decides to take, then my bishop is going to be able to escape. And if he decides to attack my bishop, no, I just need to take on b4 and my bishop is fine. So we're ahead by a piece. The goal from here is just to start trading some pieces off the board, go to an endgame. Or because we're ahead by a piece, we could start an attack on the opponent's king. So he decides to play pawn to e5, which is not a bad move because if I try to take on e5, he's going to take my bishop. And then once I take his rook, he's going to take on e5. I'm not able to move my knight any squares forward, which means I have to pull my knight back to e8. And now he's able to play moves like knight d5 and attack my queen. So that's not a bad move. But let's see how he's going to be following up with this. Okay. He decides to play the move knight e4. But that's a suspicious move though, because now the pawn on e5 is just completely hanging. Like there's nothing guarding the pawn. So let's just take the free pawn. Now my queen guards my knight and my bishop. So if he tries to move the knight, I'm just gonna gladly trade. My bishop on a3 is still unprotected, but once I take, the rook is gonna be guarding it. He decides to play knight c5, attacking my bishop. So let's just trade the bishops off the board. Again, my plan is to trade the pieces off the board. And now that he plays king takes g2, I'm now gonna play the move queen to c6, which checks the king. Now he has to be very careful because moving the king back to g1 is an immediate fork. So I'm expecting him to play something like pawn to f3 to block the check, or maybe just pulling the knight back. If he pulls the knight back though, then he's pinning the knight and we're just going to apply pressure to the pin knight. So what's the move here? Pawn to f3. He has to play pawn to f3. He decides to pull back the king, not making this up. That's not just a fork because even though the queen guards the square, my queen protects the f3 square. Now he has to move the king. He is also at risk of getting checkmated here, so he has to be careful. For example, he has to move his king on a light square. He decides to play the move king f1. And am I able to take on h2 first with check? If I take on h2, the king goes to e2, I play queen f3, the king goes to d2, we're not checkmating the king. Because we're not checkmating the king, let's just take the rook. And the moment I didn't even take back the knight. Oh, okay, let's just take the pawn. He didn't take the knight, so let's just save the knight. Now we're ahead by 10 points. 10 whole entire points. I didn't even use my rooks. So now I'm going to try to get my knight in the game, try to deliver some checkmates. His pawn on h2 is hanging though. Let's see how he responds to this. So the queen moved to d3. My knight is already guarded. I need to bring more pieces in the game though. So let's play knight to f6 here. I'm trying to play moves like knight g4. That's still a free pawn, by the way, but I'm trying to get all my pieces in the game. I'm not even sure if I need to use my bishop, to be honest, because once I get my rooks in the game, it should be enough to deliver a checkmate, especially if my knight gets access to this g4 square and cover these f2 and e3 squares. So the rook moves over to d1. Maybe he's trying to win a pawn on d7, who knows? But let's continue to go for the king. If I put my knight here and then I take with check, I'm not seeing the mate though. That's kind of weird. Let's just take on b4. Let's take on b4. If he decides to take on b4 with the pawn, then my bishop takes and his knight is going to be under attack. So let's just take. The good thing is my rook could now get access to his second rank, and then my rook is just going to be cutting off the entire second rank, and that should help me to deliver some checkmating attacks on his king. So the knight went back to h3. That's still a free pawn. But let's play the move rook to a2 so that we cut off the opponent's king from ever entering the second rank. And then I'm going to be thinking about moves like knight h2 check with some queen to h1 checkmating ideas. Okay, that was also a free knight. I just didn't take a free knight. Okay, queen to b3 was played. This has to be a checkmate. So my rook is under attack, his knight is hanging. But let's start with the forcing moves. Let's play the move knight to h2 check. The king is in check. The king has to move. King is not able to go here. King has to go to g1. Yeah, this is definitely going to be leading to a checkmate because once the king goes to g1, taking on c5 comes with check. The king is still not able to move because my queen covers this square, my knight covers this square, my rook guards the knight. He blocks with the queen. We grab the queen. Now he has to block with the knight. Well, instead of taking the knight with check, I'm going to actually take with the rook so that way queen to g2 is just going to be a checkmate on the next move, regardless of what he plays. With that being said, we're going to be playing more Sicilian defense against 900 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 900. We're still playing the aggressive Sicilian defense. Knight to f3, and the move I'm going to be playing is pawn to e6. We're now playing the can variation of the Sicilian defense. Very, very aggressive line. Knight c3, we play a6. Now, these are the thematic stuff that we need to remember. Where the pawn goes, where the queen goes. That's like step one. You're always going to see pawn to d4, especially against persons who knows what they're doing. So whenever they play pawn d4, we're taking on d4. The knight is going to take on d4. And the reason why we play pawn to a6 is so that way our queen goes to c7. This queen on c7 is going to be so useful in the Sicilian can. Because for one, we're applying a lot of pressure to this knight on c3. So you're going to be seeing moves like bishop to b4, applying pressure to the knight. But two, if this king ever gets castled, the queen also applies a lot of pressure to the h2 pawn, and the queen prevents the pawn from coming to e5. So after a move like bishop to d3, we could continue with knight to f6. There is also bishop to b4 in this position, but the king could simply castle. So let's just start by playing the move knight to f6. The opponent now decides to castle the king, and another very nice thematic move that we're going to be playing is pawn to b5. Now, what does pawn to b5 does? For one, it allows us to fianchetto or light squared bishop, which will also be pointing towards the opponent's king. In some variation, this dark squared bishop will either go to c5 to pin the knight on d4 or even d6 to apply pressure to this h2 pawn. Bishop to e3 was played, and there's just so many thematic stuff here in this line that I want to teach you guys. But first thing I'm going to do is fianchetto my bishop. Now keep in mind that I am applying pressure to this e4 pawn twice. The opponent is defending the pawn 2 times, which means a move like pawn to b4 is already a threat of winning a pawn. So he has to be careful of what he's trying to do. And another very nice idea that I want to show you guys is this move pawn to h5. A lot of times in the Sicilian can, we're not even going to get castled. Now, sometimes we're going to be getting castled, but sometimes we're not going to be getting castled because these pawns around the king actually keeps the king safe in the center of the board. So queen to f3 was played, and what he's doing is he's applying additional defense to his e4 pawn, which means if I play pawn to b4 and he moves the knight, he's not going to be losing the pawn. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be continuing by, it's either pawn to h5 or knight to c6. Like, these are all good moves, to be honest. But before I go with pawn to h5, let's just play knight c6. I mean, it's a development move. We're still trying to follow principles as best as we can. And all we're trying to do is ensure that we get all 4 of our minor pieces developed. So it doesn't really matter which opening I play, as you guys could see. I always try to ensure that all 4 of the minor pieces are developed. So in some cases, we're going to play pawn h5 followed by knight to g4, so that way we could start some attack on the opponent's king like this. Rook to d1 was played. Okay, not bad. If I takes, the bishop takes, I do not get anything. Knight e5, very interesting move. In fact, if I play knight g5, I think he's going to play queen g3. But then, okay, if bishop d6, there should be queen takes g7. So that's a bit tricky. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's now start by playing the move pawn h5. Obviously, I'm trying to play knight g4. And this is the whole idea of the Sicilian can. Whenever they play moves like pawn to f3, that's usually when we play moves like bishop to d6, because pawn to f3, it weakens their dark squares. And whenever we put the bishop on d6, it further weakens their dark squares. Knight takes c6 was played. That's a decent move. Now, here's what I'm seeing. If I take with the pawn, my bishop on b7 is not that strong. I mean, I could take with the queen. Taking with the queen is a nice move, but the reason why I'm going to well, if I take with the bishop, there is bishop to f4 actually, and I don't want to allow bishop to f4 unless I'm able to play bishop to d6. So I'm actually going to choose to take with the queen. So that way I'm applying a lot of pressure to e4. I wanted to take with the bishop, but he's going to play bishop to f4. I'm not trying to allow that. Now, what I'm noticing is this pawn on e4 is under attack 1, 2, 3 times. He is guarding the pawn 1, 2, 3 times, which means if I'm able to play pawn to b4, which is a thematic move if you're going to be a Sicilian can player, then we're just going to be winning the pawn on e4. Pawn to h3 was played, and now we just play the move pawn to b4. And this is just a thematic removing the guard tactic. I mean, if you notice, as we just said, he has three defenders, we have three attackers, play pawn to b4, chase away the knight from guarding the pawn, and just like that, we're winning the e4 pawn. Knight back to e2 was played, and if you do the count, now we have three attackers. The opponent only has two defenders, which means once we take on e4, we're just going to be ahead by a pawn. Now, what he could try to do is give up his bishop for a knight, but that's not necessarily going to be helping him. Knight to d4 is also a try because, he's now trying to do a removing the guard tactic on me. But once I put my queen on d5, I maintain the defense of my knight, and then everything is just going to be fine. Knight to g3, I was not expecting. Now, what this does, it applies more pressure to my knight, which is not pinned, which means, I mean, I should be able to just take the knight. If I take the knight, however, I think he's going to first take my queen. I'm thinking of playing either pawn to f5 or pawn to d5. I like both of these moves. Like if I play pawn to d5 and he chooses to take with the knight, then he's just going to be getting forked. If he takes with the bishop, I take, I hit the queen, queen to f4, and he seems to be doing fine, to be honest. So let's just take the knight. I mean, we're ahead by a pawn. We're just going to be going into the end game. He did not choose to go into the end game, which is weird because not only am I ahead by a pawn, but there's this battery that is pointing towards his g2 pawn, and it could get deadly. What if I just play pawn to h5 and attack his queen again? Where's he going to put the queen? Maybe queen to g4, to be honest. He's probably going to play queen to g4. And I also want to play bishop to d6 to attack the queen, but him taking on g7 could be an issue. So let me just use the time to get my king out the center of the board. We're still trying to develop. We're still trying to remain principled, which means once I hit him with pawn to h4, no, I'm going to be removing the piece that is preventing him from getting checkmated. So this move has to be very crucial for him. He has to be careful. Bishop to f4, I understand because he doesn't want to allow me to play bishop to d6, but I'm still trying to play pawn to h4 though, because this is just typical removing the guard. I have two pieces targeting his g2 pawn. He has two pieces protecting the g2 pawn. Hit him with a move like pawn to h4. I'm just trying to chase away the queen, to be honest. The question is, where does the queen go? If he puts the queen on h2, then okay, the queen just never joins the game anymore, so I'm happy with that. If he puts the queen on f3, I'm winning another pawn. If he puts the queen on g4, I hit him with pawn to f5 and attack the queen again. Yeah, I think we got him. Yeah, I think we got him this one. The queen is on h2, which means the queen will not see the light of day again. The queen is just blocked out of the game. Now, here's another very cool idea that I want you guys to use. You ready for this? Pawn to g5. Okay, you think I'm going crazy. I'm sacrificing a pawn, and once his bishop takes, my rook is going to be unprotected. That was such a horrible move. But that's not the case, because if he decides to take on g5 and then I hit him with rook to g8, my rook is untouchable because rook takes g2 ends the game immediately. Now, what I think he should play is actually bishop to e5. That's not a bad move. But my whole idea is to open this g file. My rook is under attack, so I'm thinking of playing rook to g8. The thing is, if I play rook to g8, bishop to h7 could be an issue. So because I want to play pawn to f6, I'm going to play the move rook to h6, so that way I'm able to play pawn to h6. And then once I play pawn to f6 and chase away that bishop, okay, I'm actually stupid. I should have played pawn to f6, and if bishop takes, bishop d6, hit the queen. Okay. Now he plays pawn. Look at this queen. Like, what is this queen doing on h2? Look on his light scores. His light scores is completely just, it's just mine. Okay, let's continue with our plan. First, let's play pawn to a6. Let's chase away that dark squared bishop. And then my plan is to take on g3, and then this file is just going to be completely open for me. But we're going to be patient with this attack. Keep in mind, black is playing ahead by a queen. And the beginners who are watching this is probably saying, bro, you're not ahead by a queen. The guy's queen is on the board. But yes, the queen is on the board, but it's not able to move. So I'll say it again. Black is ahead by a queen. The bishop goes back to d6. Now I could take, I'm assuming he's just going to take back. It's fine, but I'm not really seeing exactly what I get. So let's finally develop the dark squared bishop to d6. The pawn on g3 is now pinned. This diagonal is gonna cost him a lot. Then he decides to play rook to e1, which didn't really do anything. I mean, I guess he's trying to get his rook in the game. Now, what is my plan? I would love to get a queen on g2 or h1. It would be checkmate. The only reason why it's not a checkmate is the fact that his queen is on h2. So what I'm thinking of is to take the pawn, and then if he takes, I play bishop takes g3. It forks the queen and the rook, and then once his queen takes on g3, I hit him with queen to h1 check. But then the king goes to h2, and my queen is under attack, and I'm not really seeing what I get for that. I'm also thinking of takes, and then try to sacrifice on h3. But once the queen takes, it still guards h1. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to play the move rook to h8. And yes, I'm doubling up my rooks behind a pawn, but this pawn is pinned. And once I take on g3, I'm going to play rook takes h3. Bishop to e4 is a very nice move. I was not expecting bishop to g4. But here's how I'm gonna respond to this move. This is gonna be nice. Instead of moving my queen away, we know that offense is the best defense, and I'm gonna play the move pawn takes g3. Not moving my queen away, but I'm counter-attacking his queen. If he decides to take my queen, I'm gonna take his queen with a check, which means I'm gonna be winning the bishop. But what happens if he just decides to not take my queen and decides to play the move pawn takes g3? Pawn takes g3 was what he plays, and I'm thinking of sacrificing my queen. I really don't need to be this fancy. I'm also thinking of playing rook takes h3, which hits the queen, and then if he takes my queen, I take his queen. He takes my bishop, I take his bishop. Mm, Not the attack that I wanted. What if? Nah, that doesn't work. Okay, maybe I should just move the queen, to be honest. Like, move the queen, he takes my bishop, I take his bishop, and his h3 pawn is still gonna be hanging. That's definitely an idea. Okay, I really didn't want his bishop to get on this diagonal, to be honest, but let's just move the queen to b5. If he takes my bishop, I take back, and then the plan is going to be to take on h3. Like, once I take on h3, he should be either getting checkmated or losing his queen. But let's see what he does. He also only has a minute on his clock, so things are about to get spicy. He took the bishop with check. Let's take back with the queen. I'm still applying a lot of pressure to this diagonal. And keep in mind, we're ahead by a pawn. So if he tries to trade, we're going to be ahead by a lot of pawns. For example, if he tries to play queen to g2, we would have just won 2 pawns off the bat. Rook to e3, and this is where we conclude the game. Because his rook on d1 is unprotected. Hit him with rook takes h3. I'm already attacking the queen. The queen has nowhere to go. If he plays the move queen to g2, I'm still going to be hitting him with rook to h1, and it's over. This is called a skewer, by the way, guys. And I actually have 3 pieces covering the h1 square. So even though he plays queen to g2, I'm still allowed to play the move rook to h1 check. If he decides to move the king, am I going to be taking a free rook? No, because whenever you see a good move, you should always look for a better one. Because the queen and the king is on the same line, these are the attacks that you guys are going to be getting once you play the Sicilian can. We pull the rook back to h2, pinning the queen to the king, and that's just GG's. The queen is not able to move. I'm threatening to grab the queen. He decides to play rook to h1, but this is now just checkmate in a few moves. I'm going to just play queen takes h2, check. The king is then forced to move back, grab the rook, and that should be a checkmate. So let's take the queen and say check. The king has to go back, and that's just checkmate. More Sicilian can against 1,000 rated players. Stick around. Opponent is now 1,000, plays e4. Let's play the Sicilian defense. Immediate pawn to d4 was played. We're always going to be taking on d4 if they play d4. And then queen takes d4 was played, which is not good. I was expecting the Smith-Morra gambit, but let's just develop our knight, gain the tempo on the queen, and then once the queen move, we continue with the regular Sicilian can ideas. And the whole idea is to play the move pawn to e6. And then once the knight is developed, we play pawn to a6. So that way, once our queen gets to the c7 square, there's no knight to b5 or just any way to attack my queen. So knight to f3, we play queen to c7, putting the queen on the square. Pawn to a3 was played, which means he's basically preventing my bishop from going to the b4 square. Let's just develop the knight to f6. And the thing is, he is able to play pawn e5 and attack my knight, but it actually does not work. I was about to say I was able to play knight g4, but now that he plays h3, you could say he's threatening to play pawn to e5. and attack my knight because the queen covers the e5 square. What I'm going to do, however, is there's two moves that I'm thinking of here. I'm thinking of knight e5, and then if he takes, my queen takes. But then the idea of him playing f4 is very strong. The other move that I'm thinking of is just the simple bishop to d6. And it looks a bit dangerous because it looks like I'm trying to allow him to fork me. But I have enough pieces covering the e5 square. Now that he plays bishop to d3, now I'm going to play pawn b5 with the whole idea of, in some cases, I could play b4, hit the knight, and then bishop takes. Other cases, it's just bishop to b7, so that way both my bishops are on the same line as his king if he decides to castle on the king side. Knight to d5 is a very interesting move. Unfortunately, it does not work. He's just donating an entire knight. But his idea is if I take the knight, he takes back, the queen checks my king, and my knight is under attack. However, I am going to take the free knight because if he decides to take with the pawn, thinking, okay, my pawn is going to attack your knight, my queen is going to be checking your king, I'm just going to block the check with the knight. And I'm just going to be ahead by an entire piece. So the natural stuff, we're 10 moves into the Sicilian can, and we're already ahead by a piece. So he took the pawn. Again, the queen attacks my king, the pawn attacks my knight. But once I pull my knight back to e7, I save my knight, and I'm also threatening to play the move knight takes d5, just winning another pawn. So I'm not sure what he saw, but I'm already ahead by a piece. And once I play bishop to b7, that's also more pressure on the pawn, which means it's guaranteed that he's also going to be losing this pawn. Queen to g4, that's an interesting move because if I try to take his pawn, he's just going to be taking my pawn on g7. So this is actually one of those cases where we're actually going to be castling our king on the king side, so that way we're protecting our pawn on g7. But it's actually very easy for us to develop here. Like, black has no issues. We're going to be taking the pawn on d5 with either one of our knights. The bishop will still go to b7, and our rooks is going to be going one on e8, one on c8, and then every piece is going to be very active. Pawn to g3. I'm not sure why he would do that. Like, I wasn't really trying to do anything with my queen and my bishop, or maybe he wants to put a bishop on f4. I mean, let's just take the free pawn on d5. That was the plan anyways. And it looks as if he's going to be keeping his king in the center of the board, which he did. And he also puts the bishop on f4. Like, guy doesn't even know how to count. It's crazy because I have one, two, three pieces on the f4 square. He only has two pieces guarding the f4 square. With that being said, I'm thinking about playing rook to e8 check, just to check his king first. But okay, I'm actually going to do it. Let's play rook to e8 check, checking the king first. Because if he decides to block with the bishop, then once I take the bishop, if the pawn takes my knight, then his g3 pawn is going to be left unprotected. If he decides to move his king, that's it for his castle. If he decides to block with the bishop, then the bishop is just going to be pinned forever. He moves the king to d2. Horrible move, by the way, because no, we're not even going to be trading. The king and the queen is now on the same diagonal, which means once I play the move knight takes f4, I'm now ahead by two pieces because the pawn is now not able to take. I mean, if he does take, then I'm going to take back on f4, and that's just going to be a fork. Because of the counting, I have more pieces covering the f4 square than the amount of defensive pieces he has covering the f4 square. So from here, I'm probably going to just go bishop b7, put my bishop on the long diagonal, attack this unprotected knight. I mean, this is just GG's, to be honest. He resigns. But more Sicilian defense against 1100 rated players. Stick around. Opponent is now 1100. Play z4. Let's play pawn c5. This is the Sicilian defense. We're going to be playing the aggressive Sicilian Khan. Now, the opponent is actually playing what is called the Smith-Morra Gambit, where once we take on d4, well, I thought he's going to play pawn to c6, but this is not really good because we're going to be able to get the same Khan setup, but we're going to be getting an extra tempo. So let's just play knight c6. Let's just gain the tempo on the queen, forcing the queen to move. And then once the queen moves, we continue with the regular Sicilian Khan idea, which is to move a pawn to e6, move a pawn to a6, and put our queen on the c7 square. So knight f3 was played. Let's play pawn to a6. Now, The thing is with this queen on a4 is a bishop is actually still able to get to this b5 square because I'm not going to be able to take due to the pin. But if the bishop goes to b5, it really doesn't do anything. He decides to play pawn to c4. Let's continue with our plan. Let's put the queen on c7 so that way it's harder for the opponent to play pawn to e5, and then it's also going to be hard for the opponent to play bishop to f4. And then I'm going to continue with my plan of playing moves like knight f6. And if the opponent decides to castle the king very early, then I'm going to be able to play pawn h5, knight g4, knight d4, and then we're going to be going for the thematic checkmate on h2. So bishop to d2 was played. The opponent is developing their pieces. Let's go knight to f6, developing the knight, attacking the unprotected pawn. The opponent decided to play bishop to d3, guarding the pawn. And here I'm going to start by developing my bishop to c5. I mean, I'm applying some pressure to the f2 pawn. I'm expecting him to develop his knight to c3, get his king out the center of the board. Like in some cases, we may see knight c3 followed by queenside castle, but that will be leaving the pawn on f2 unprotected. So he did decide to castle the king, and now we're going to be going for the thematic attacking idea that I discussed in the intro. And it starts with the move knight to g4. Now, the moment we play knight g4, we're trying to deliver like all kinds of checkmate on the h2 pawn. The good thing about this is we do not care if they play pawn to h3 to attack the knight because we're not going to move the knight. We're going to be playing the fishing pole 2.0 by hitting them with pawn to h5 because if takes, he's going to be getting checkmate on h2 if he moves the knight. So it's going to be good for us anyways. Bishop to e3 was played. That's not a bad move because I think he notices that I want to play knight to d4. So he decides to put the bishop on e3. Okay, I kind of lied a bit. Bishop to e3 is a bad move because I have two pieces covering the e3 square. He only has one piece guarding the e3 square, which means I'm just able to win a pawn. The question is, how am I going to capture? Now, bishops are better than knights, so I'm just going to make the capture with the knight. And then once he takes, we make the capture with the bishop. The king is already in check. And just like that, 11 moves into our Sicilian can. And we are already ahead by a pawn. Now, the king decides to move over to h1. And here I'm trying to finish my development. Like my bishop on b on c8 is not really doing anything. I'm actually not able to play b5 due to this pawn on c4. So instead, I'm going to play the move pawn to b6, and I'm still going to be putting the bishop on b7. But this time, the bishop will be on the same diagonal as his king. So the queen went all the way back to d1. I guess he's trying to bring some pieces to defend his king. It doesn't really do much though. Let's just play bishop to b7 here. And we can always just castle our king on the queen side and then just launch our pawns on his king side to start our attack. Rook to e1 was played. I mean, my bishop is under attack, so I have to move. So let's just pull it back to c5. Knight to g4 was played. Okay, it doesn't really do much, but I think he's trying to get his queen to f3 or h5 so that way he could start an attack. So here's what I'm going to do. The first move I'm going to play is knight to e5, applying some pressure to his bishop, preventing the queen from going to f3, but I'm also protecting the f7 square, which means if the queen still decides to go to h5, I could just play a move like pawn to h6, followed by something like pawn to g6. His queen is going to be under attack. He's going to be blundering his bishop. But let's see what he plays. So he decides to pull the bishop back. He saves the bishop. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be using the principle of neutralization, which states if a piece is on our half of the board, we chase that piece out. So now he has to move the knight. And once the knight goes back to f3, I'm actually not going to take the knight, even though I'm ahead by a pawn. I'm actually going to be putting my knight on g4 because of the same thematic idea where we're threatening a lot of stuff on h2. But this time, if my knight goes to the g4 square, I'm going to be threatening a royal fork on f2. So he pulls the knight back to f3, and as we discussed, no need to take the knight, hit him with knight g4. Now, there's all kind of threats in the position. He's now at risk of, I think he's going to lose an entire rook because he has to play something like rook to f1. And if he plays rook to f1, I may actually not immediately play knight to f2 to win the rook because he's still going to be losing the rook anyways with either knight e3 or knight f2. So if rook to f1, I'm going to be trying to focus my attention on chasing his knight away from the f3 square. So for example, because I noticed that my bishop is on the same line as the knight, I'm thinking of playing moves like pawn to f5 so that way I can take on e4 and attack the knight. And then if the pawn takes on f5, my bishop is going to be able to take on f3, removing the knight, which is the main defender of the h2 pawn. Then I'm going to be able to take on h2. So rook to f1 was played, and again, that's winning the rook because he has to sack. That's winning the rook because once he moves the queen, I'm going to take the rook. But because I'm going for a checkmate, I'm going to play the move pawn to f5 because I'm trying to chase away this knight. And remember what we said about our knight on g4. If a pawn ever goes to h3 thinking, okay, let's just chase away the knight, we do not move the knight. We play the move pawn to h4, protecting the knight because he's just never ever going to be able to take the knight. Because if he decides to take the knight, my pawn taking back the pawn is actually just going to be a checkmate because the king is not going to be able to move to g1 because my bishop and my rook on h8 will be attacking his king. So knight to d2 was played. Again, if I play knight to e3, I'm winning a rook because his queen has to move. We grab the rook. If I play knight to f2, I'm also winning a rook. If I take, however, I think he's just going to take back. His knight is being supported. So the threat will always be better than the execution. So let me just use the time to get my king out the center of the board. My plan from here is to play moves like rook to f8, putting my rook on the same file as the knight on f3, because my whole idea is just to find a way to get rid of that knight on f3, even if I have to sacrifice a rook. But once I'm able to get rid of the knight on f3, queen to h2 is going to be a checkmate. So I'm basically trying to set up a removing the guard tactic. He plays pawn to a3. I'm assuming he's trying to play the move pawn to b4. But now I'm going to play the move rook to f8, putting my rook on the same file as the knight. Now he has to be careful because the plan from here is to take on e4. Notice what he just did? He attacks my bishop, but no need to move the bishop if I'm able to take on e4, attacking the knight. If he takes my bishop, I take his knight, and he will be getting checkmated on h2. This is like the definition of whenever you find a good move, look for a better one. Because the whole time we're able to fork. He took the bishop. Now let's just get rid of the knight. Queen to h2 is going to be a checkmate on the next move. And the best he could do is try to take back with the knight on d2. But I already have two pieces covering the f3 square. This is like one of the perfect examples of exactly what could happen in the Sicilian can if you really understand all the ideas. Okay, now he took on g4 because he's probably saying if I take on g4, the king goes to g1, I check on h2, the king goes to f2, but then I take on g2 with check. Like there's so many ways to win this. I can also just take on g2 here with check, and then the king is going to be forced to move to g1, and then I'm winning a rook. But we're trying to mate here. So h takes g4, king moves to g1, queen h2, check. King goes to f2, queen g2 check, king goes to e1, and I'm not really seeing a mate. But this should lead to a checkmate. Let's play h takes g, check. This has to lead to a mate, or I'm at least going to be winning his rook because the king now has to go to g1. I'm going to check on h2, and then once the king goes to f2, my pawn is going to be able to take. And I'm sure someone is going to comment that I missed a checkmate. I mean, I'm not seeing it though, but let's give a check on h2. The king now has to go to f2, putting the king on the same file as my rook. These are the types of attack that you guys are going to be getting. The king moves. Now we play pawn takes g2, checking the king. He moves the king to e3. And okay, that's a rook. Do we have a mate? I mean, there is rook to h3 bringing more pieces in the attack. And then his king goes back to e2. Then I take. And then that may lead to a checkmate. So let's start by playing rook to h3. Again, very typical example of whenever you see a good move, always look for a better one. Because now if he puts his king on e2, once I take the rook, it's going to be like a double check. So he decided to block with the rook. I guess it's because he knew that he's going to lose the rook anyways, but let's just take the rook. Let's just take the rook. Queen to e5 could lead to a checkmate. I could queen my pawn and that could lead to a checkmate. I could play queen to f4 and that could lead to a checkmate. But he has no time on the clock. So Okay, he has zero point 0.3 seconds on the clock. So let's play pawn to f2. And with that being said, more Sicilian can against 1200 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 1200, plays e4. Let's go with the Sicilian defense. He plays knight to f3. We're going to be playing pawn to e6. And if d4, we're just going to be taking the pawn. If they don't play d4, we play a6 followed by queen c7. So for example, knight c3, we play a6. A lot of times in this position, they still play d4, which means it transposes into something that we already know. Oh, but then he decides to play b3. Like, that's an interesting move. I think he's trying to just fianchetto his bishop. Let's go queen c7, though. Let's just continue with our idea. Bishop moves to b2. Now I'm going to play the move pawn to b5. Why am I playing pawn to b5? Because for one, I'm trying to develop my light squared bishop. I'm trying to play the move bishop b7 to apply pressure to the pawn. And I'm also trying to play moves like b4, which would chase away the knight, which is the main defender of his e4 pawn. Okay, he finally played pawn to d4. Remember what we said. Pawn goes to d4, we take the pawn on d4. This is now a bit suspicious because the knight on c3 also becomes a target. So he has to be careful not to lose the knight. Like, for example, once we play moves like bishop to b4, pinning the knight to the king, he could be at risk of losing that knight. So he decides to play the move queen takes d4. Maybe he's trying to castle his king on the queen side. Let's just play the move knight c6. I mean, that's a free tempo on his queen. The queen is forced to move. And then once the queen goes back to d2, we finish our development by playing the move knight to f6. So only our bishop is in need of development now. The light squared bishop could go to b7. The dark squared bishop could actually go to b4 and apply a lot of pressure to his pinned knight, which is why he plays pawn to a3. He doesn't want me to pin his knight, but that's not going to be helping him. Because here's the thing. The knight is the only defender of the e4 pawn. So now if I play pawn to b4, if he moves the knight, I take the e4 pawn and I'm ahead by a pawn. If he takes on b4, however, my bishop takes on b4 and his knight will still be pinned to the queen and the king. So he took the pawn, helping me to develop my bishop, which means all I need to do is develop one more bishop and all my pieces are going to be fully developed. So he decides to play the move queen to e3, which is not a bad move because the queen actually serves as one of the defenders of this pawn on e4 because this knight on c3 is not guarding the pawn. Now, what I'm thinking of here is playing moves like pawn to d5. And then if he takes, my knight takes and I hit the queen, I'm also applying a lot of pressure to his e4 pawn. If he plays pawn to e5, I should be able to play knight to g4 and attack the queen. So pawn to d5 is just a very strong move in this position. It doesn't really threaten pawn to d4 because he has a lot of pieces on d4. But what we said is if he decides to take, my knight takes, which means not only am I applying more pressure to the pinned knight, but I'm also attacking his queen. So he has to move his queen somewhere where it guards the knight at the same time. And I actually think he's losing here because I have one, two pieces attacking the pinned knight. He has one, two pieces guarding the pinned knight. But my queen is on c7. And what we spoke about is the queen on c7 also serves as one of the attacking piece on the c3 knight. So I literally just need to move my knight out the way and his knight is going to be under attack. So now that he plays queen to d2, as we said, once I move my knight, I'm going to be winning a piece. The question is just where do I put the knight? Do I play knight e5 and then if he takes, I check? Then I grab the knight? Or do I just pull my knight back to e7? Let's just pull the knight back to e7. This is winning. The knight is pinned. We have one, two, three pieces attacking the pinned knight. He only has two pieces guarding the pinned knight. We know the old saying PP on the PP. Once you pin a piece, you want to be applying pressure to that pin piece. Bishop to b5 check is actually a very interesting move because if I take the bishop, he takes my rook. Still doesn't change the fact that he's about to lose the knight though. So let's just move the king out the way. Knight is still going to be lost. So maybe he could try to castle the king, but I'm just going to grab the knight. Piece is a piece at the end of the day. Maybe he should have tried bishop to c4, actually. That's what he should have tried. Yeah, I think he needs to just play bishop c4 here. Because if he plays bishop c4, I have two pieces attacking the knight, and my queen is no longer going to be attacking his knight. But let's see what he does. Well, he decided to castle his king, which means That's just a free knight. So let's just take the knight. If he takes my knight, then I take his bishop. And I'm also going to be forking his queen and his rook. Otherwise, I'm also attacking his bishop on b5. I'm not able to take with the pawn, but I could be able to take with my knight. Now he plays queen to g5. You see, he's trying to be tricky because if I take his bishop on b5, it exposes this diagonal, and then he takes on g7, and then a lot of stuff could happen. So let's deal with this threat first. Like, I want to take the free bishop, but let's deal with the fact that there's a lot of pieces pointing towards g7, and let's play the move pawn to h6, which immediately attacks the queen. So I'm assuming he's gonna play queen to g4. But if he plays queen g4, he puts his queen on the same diagonal as my bishop. If he plays queen to g3, I trade the queen, then I take the free bishop. If he just moves this queen away, then I should be able to take a free bishop. What will he play? All right, he pulls the queen back to e3. Didn't really do much. I think he could have actually tried queen h4 to attack my bishop, but once I take this, that's just going to be a free bishop. I'm also considering to play something like knight d5 or knight f5, just to apply more attack to his queen. Because, but then if I attack his queen, well, he won't be able to guard the bishop. But just to keep things simple, let's just take the free bishop first. We're ahead by 2 pieces. It's funny, we're ahead by 2 pieces and we're 15 moves into the Sicilian cat. It's crazy. So rook to d1 was played. The rook is on an open file. Need to be slightly careful, slightly careful. Let's go knight d5 here. We're attacking the queen and we're basically trying to say the rook is not as active on the open file, but I need to be aware of this fork. But then he plays queen to e5, which, he's just trying to trade the pieces off the board, even though he's down in material. So let's just trade the pieces off the board. I'm ahead by 2 pieces. Knight to e5, I still need to be aware of this fork. So I'm now going to play bishop to c3, trading more pieces off the board. My bishop attacks his unprotected bishop. His knight is under attack, which means he's forced to trade. Once he takes, I play knight takes, hit the rook. Being ahead by 2 pieces, it's going to be a very easy win from here. He took, let's take, hit the rook. Rook has to move. Now I just need to get both of my rooks in the game. Rook to d2 was played. If I play pawn to f6 attacking his knight, knight g6 is going to be a fork. Remember, you have to always be aware of the drawback principle. With that being said, let's just play bishop to b7, putting my bishop on this long diagonal. The plan from here is just to swing my rook in the game. All my pieces are going to be active, and it's just going to be an easy win. Knight d7 is a check. Not too bad. Let's play king to e7, hitting the knight. And if he plays knight c5 attacking my bishop, I'm probably going to move the bishop, probably going to defend it. I mean, I'm the one who is ahead in material. I'm trying to trade the pieces off the board. So let's just defend the bishop with rook to b8. If he takes, I just take back. I'm just ahead by 2 pieces. He moves his rook to a1, which means there's 2 pieces attacking my pawn on a6. I don't mind though. Let's just play rook to c8, applying some pressure to his knight. If he thinks he's gonna just play the move knight takes a6, winning a pawn, that's actually a blunder because his rook is unprotected and I'm gonna be able to play rook a8. So he plays knight b7. Let's just grab the pawn. He took on e6, and I'm honestly just trying to look for all the ways to trade the pieces off the board. I'm going to start by playing the move knight to e4 though, attacking the unprotected rook. Now he has to move the rook out the way. I want you guys to notice how I have 2 of my rooks just on the same line as his weak back rank. So even though he's attacking my knight, I don't necessarily have to move the knight. I could actually play moves like rook takes b3, sacrificing my rook and be like, oh no, my rook. Because if he takes my knight, he gets checkmated on the back rank. If he takes my rook this way, he still gets checkmated on the back rank, which is why he resigns. More Sicilian defense against 1,300 players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 1,300. We're still going to be playing some aggressive Sicilian can. Knight f3, we're going to be playing pawn to e6, and we're also going to be playing pawn to h6. Like, this is the whole thematic idea. For example, if they do not play d4, which I'm expecting him to play in the future, just play pawn to a6, and you're still going to be following the regular natural setup without them playing pawn d4. If they do play pawn d4, just take the pawn on d4. For example, this guy decides to play bishop to d3, which is weird for 1,300 because he's blocking out his dark squared bishop. We're just going to be following the regular simple setup, putting the queen on c7. Why queen c7, you may ask? It points towards h2, and whenever they play d4, it applies pressure to the knight. So he decides to castle his king. And now I'm actually going to play knight c6 a bit earlier. And the reason why I'm going to play knight c6 is I want to be aware of this pawn coming to e5. And I'm also trying to play knight to f6. Now he plays pawn to b3. He's trying to fianchetto his bishop. Okay, that's fine. That's decent. Let's go knight to f6. We're just developing our pieces normally. Eventually, I can also play pawn to b5, pointing my bishop towards his king. So now that he plays bishop to b2, I want to introduce you guys to something very cool. Like especially my low level elo players below, like let's say 1500. I'm actually gonna play knight g4 here. Like, why am I gonna play a move like knight g4? Why am I moving the same pieces more than once in the opening stage of the game? Why isn't he able to just play pawn to h3 and then just chase away my knight? That's because of the fishing pole trap 2.0. So this is not the fishing pole trap where your queen joins the attack via h4. This is the fishing pole trap where if they play h3 and I play h5, if he decides to take my knight and I take back his knight, I'm automatically already threatening a checkmate on h2. Like these are some crazy positions that could happen in the Sicilian Khan. We're already attacking. We're 8 moves into the Sicilian Khan. He pulls his knight back to e2. That's actually not a bad move because my threat was to play knight to d4 and apply some pressure to that knight. But I think I know what he's trying to do, and I'm going to set it up perfectly so that way he's not allowed to do it. So, first of all, if he takes my knight, I take, he's going to be getting checkmated. I need my dark squared bishop to join the attack. What move am I going to play? I'm just going to play pawn c4. It seems like a crazy move because his bishop is also on the same diagonal as my pawn, which means if I try to move my bishop, I'm going to be losing my pawn. But I'm still allowed to do all of these things because of the attack that I have on his king. So now I'm going to go bishop to c5. I'm applying a lot of pressure to his f2 pawn. Now I'm also preventing his knight from going to the g3 square because of the f2 pawn being pinned. And if he takes on g7, I simply need to play rook to h7, which he did. He took on g7. Also, in a lot of cases, my rook going to g8 is also very, very strong because once he moves the bishop, his g2 pawn is going to be under a lot of pressure. Because I'm not trying to move my knight from the g4 square, let's just play rook to h7. Keep in mind, we're down by 2 pawns, so we have to be very aggressive with this attack. We also have to ensure that we bring as many pieces in the attack. So here's what's happening. He's not able to take my knight due to the mate threat that is on h2. He's not able to bring his knight into the defense due to queen takes. My bishop is on the same line as his king, which means all I need to try to do now is to bring more pieces in the attack. How am I going to do that? Pawn to b6. The plan from here is just to fianchetto my bishop, possibly castle on the queen side, swing my rook to g8, and then every single piece will be in the attack. On to e4. That's not a bad move because it's a discovered attack on my rook. I am forced to move my rook, by the way. I'm thinking of pulling it back to h8, but I am putting it on the same diagonal as its bishop. I'm also thinking of just putting it on h6. Let's just put the rook on h6. The rook is usually active on h6, and it also looks as if he's trying to give me back another pawn because now I have 3 pieces attacking e5. He only has 2 pieces guarding e5. He could also try to take on h4 now, seeing that way it's not really easy for my queen to join the attack. But if he takes and I takes back, he's still going to be losing the e5 pawn. And if he loses the e5 pawn, which he did, let's just take on g4. Now his knight is under attack. And I'm going to now take on e5, and I'm going to be threatening all sorts of checkmating attacks. This is the Sicilian defense, by the way. Like, these are the types of crazy scenarios that happens when you play the Sicilian. You notice he didn't even move the knight. He's like, I'm not going to move the knight. I'm just going to be giving you back the knight. So let's just take the knight on f3. He decides to take with his queen, and I'm not able to take on e5 because I'm going to be losing my rook. But now once I put my bishop on b7, I'm also putting my bishop on the same diagonal as the queen, which means once I get the thematic castle the king, swing the rook over to the h file or even the g file, then that's where you're going to be seeing the problems that he's going to be facing. Queen to g4 was played. I think he wants to check, but that's an inaccurate move though, because my plan was just to castle my king. So that was definitely an inaccurate move. Now his e5 pawn is under attack. All my pieces are in the attack. All my pieces are in the attack except my d8 rook. Once I play rook to h8 or possibly in some lines get my rooks on the g file, then it's going to be game over for him. Knight to e5 was played. Knight e5 was also inaccurate, bro. Because if I'm able to get a rook on h1 that's mate, the knight on g3 was actually defending against the checkmate. So what happens if I just play rook to h now, rook to h8 now? Rook h1 is just going to be a checkmate, which means knight d6 check doesn't do anything. Knight takes c5 doesn't do anything. I'm assuming he's going to play something like pawn g3. And if I check, he plays king up. And then if I check again, he plays king up. But then his king is going to be on the run. So I'm threatening a checkmate and I'm threatening the pawn on e5. I'm down by 2 pawns, by the way. But look on the difference between my king and his king. The guy played knight d6. That's bad, bro. I told you that rook to h1 is mate. Like, I'm not trying to be fancy or anything. Trust me, I'm not trying to be fancy. But queen takes knight is just a brilliant move because he's not able to take my queen. If he takes my queen, that's mate. So now he has to play a move that prevents the checkmate, and then he's just going to be losing. I'm actually happy that he decided to resign. But more Sicilian can against 1,400 players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 1,400. Plays e4. Let's play the Sicilian. Knight f3, we play e6. This is us trying to do the Sicilian can, and apparently a lot of person doesn't do the Italian, but this is actually the Italian versus the Sicilian, which is not really good. So because the bishop pointing towards e6 doesn't really do much, let's just play pawn to e6. We have a lot of ideas of playing pawn to b5 with the bishop. He plays a4, preventing b5. So now we're going to be playing the move queen c7, and we already know what's going to come once we play queen c7. He plays knight c3, developing his knight. I'll play knight c6, also developing my knight. And my plan from here is to play knight to f6. So he plays pawn d3. He's trying to develop his bishop. I'll play knight to f6 with the idea of just finishing my development. And pawn to e5 is not really a huge threat for me in this position because I already have 2 pieces covering the square. So all I need to do from here is to play moves like bishop to e7, pawn b6, bishop to b7, and finish my development. He decides to play the move bishop to e3, which is already weird because it allows me to play knight g4 and attack his bishop. I'm not going to be rushing this idea though. So I'm going to go ahead and play the move pawn b6 so that way both of my bishops could be easily developed. And I'm also waiting on him to castle because if he castle, then I'm going to be able to attack him this way. He decides to play the move queen to d2. Now, he could try to castle his king on the queen side, but if he decides to castle on the queen side, having play pawn to a4, it will be weakening his king. So now I'm going to play the move bishop to b7, finishing my development. If he plays bishop to f4 anytime, I should be able to play bishop d6, just getting rid of the bishops off the board, and I will still be able to go with my knight g4 plan if he castles on the king side. Okay, he decided to castle the king. And now I'm looking to start my attack. So let's go knight g4, applying some pressure to h2, which the knight is guarding. But we know the whole entire game plan is to try to get rid of the knight. He plays pawn h3. I'm thinking of just playing pawn to h5, and then after takes, hit the knight. There will be bishop to f4 though, so I have to be very careful. If he plays bishop f4, I should be able to play bishop d6. Otherwise, I'm also thinking of just taking the bishop here. But because this is the whole thing that we've been looking on, let's go for the idea. If he takes, I takes, and h2 is going to be very, very weak. Bishop to f4 will be met with bishop to d6. So I like my position. I'm also trying to just get my king out the center of the board. So he did decide to play bishop f4. And what we discussed is if the bishop goes to f4, our bishop goes to d6. Because if he takes and we takes, it's just going to be the same exact thing. Okay, the knight went back to e2. That's an interesting move. I think he's basically saying if I takes, he's going to take with the queen, and then he's going to try to trade the pieces off the board. But I'm trying to set up my attack here. Let me castle my king on the queen side. This is going to be very bloody. Rook to g8 is coming. Pawn to g5 is coming. So he took on d6. I take back on d6. If he takes, I'm still going to take. He plays queen to f4 because he's desperately trying to get the queens off the board. I don't want to get the queens off the board because I'm trying to attack him. So I'm thinking of playing knight to e5, but then he should be able to take in that scenario. I'm also thinking of pulling my queen back to e7 so that way if he takes, I still gets the attack. But let's just pull the knight back to e5, just to be safe. If he takes, I'm going to take with the knight. And my plan is to play rook g8, pawn g5, and then I'm going to be attacking this way. Okay, he decided to play immediate knight to g5, which is trying to capture a free pawn, but it's not really a free pawn because it's going to help me to open some lines on my king. But because my plan was to play g5 anyways, let's just go ahead and play pawn to f6. If he still puts the knight on f7, it's just a free knight because the knight is going to be guarding the queen, which means he kind of has to pull the knight back to f3, which means knight g5 was just wasting time. And then once he pulls the knight back to f3, then I may hit him with pawn to g5, which is just attacking the queen. And then if he thinks he's taking a free pawn, I hit him with rook g8, and then that's actually going to be GG's. So he pulls the knight back to f3. Let's hit him with pawn to g5. This is the whole attacking idea, the whole attacking setup. He still decides to take on f6. He's probably saying, okay, bro, the pawn was guarding f6. It's no longer guarding f6. That's the drawback principle. But I wanted him to take because once I hit him with rook to g8, like, first of all, is the queen trapped? That's the question. The answer is no. But really think about it. Is the queen trapped? The answer is actually yes. And we just won the opponent's queen. If you play the Sicilian defense, these are the types of attack. Hope you guys see the idea. How do we win the opponent's queen? First of all, it's opposite side castles. That's one. Second of all, forcing moves on the opponent's half of the board tells us that we need to start by looking on our checks. That's two. Third of all, I could play the move knight takes f3 with check. And then if he doesn't take the knight, I just take the queen. Or I hit him with knight f3. If he takes on f3, I hit him with rook g1 and I win the queen. But what have we learned? Whenever you see a good move, always look for a better one. Even though knight f3 wins the queen, what happens if I just start? Like, what happens if I just start by playing the move rook to g8? I'm still going to win his queen, but he's also at risk of getting checkmated. And that's the purpose of this queen being on this diagonal. Guy's in trouble. I mean, this is actually resignable, to be honest, because once he moves the queen, my knight takes on f3. His pawn is not going to be able to take. He moves the queen. Queen h2 is actually going to be a checkmate. And keep in mind, we're 18 moves into the Sicilian Khan. He decides to take on h5, and now it's over. He's either going to be getting checkmate in the next two moves, or he has to sack his queen. So he plays the move queen takes h5. Let's take on f3 with check. If the king move, that's a checkmate, which he decided to move the king, which means that's just a checkmate. More Sicilian can against 1500 rated players. Stick around. Opponent is now 1500 playing e4. Let's hit him with a Sicilian. And then he's playing the Alapin variation of the Sicilian. We're still going to be going with our regular setup. Pawn goes to e6. Once a pawn goes to d4, we take on d4, and he's going to take back, and then pawn goes to a6. Like, this is the whole setup that we looked on. Now, once he plays knight to f3, I'm going to play queen c7, just to follow the regular stuff that we're looking on. And then from here, I want to play pawn b5, bishop b7, and apply pressure to this weak e4 pawn. So he plays a3 because he doesn't want my bishop coming to b4. I'm still going to play pawn to b4 though. So that way, once he plays knight c3, I play bishop b7 and I'm applying some pressure to his e4 pawn. Bishop to d3 was played. He's applying some defense to his pawn. And I want to play knight f6, but pawn d5. Let's just play knight f6. If he plays pawn to e5, I'm going to play knight to d5. And eventually, I'm going to play d6. So he decided to castle his king. I want to play pawn d6. Yeah, let's just play pawn d6 for now, so that way there's no e5. I'm thinking knight c6. I'm thinking knight d7. He plays h3, so that way the whole knight g4 idea does not work. But from here, we're actually just going to be developing as normal as possible. Let's go knight d7, not blocking out the bishop. He uses his rook to protect the pawn. Now we go bishop to e7, developing our last piece. And then he finally decides to play pawn to e5. And whenever they play pawn e5, we could take, then play knight d5. But a lot of times we could just start by playing knight d5. It's some potato type of business. And based on what I'm seeing now, my king is going to be way safer if it's castled on the king side. One more thing, if he takes on d6 and my bishop takes, That's a lot of pieces pointing towards his king. Look on b6. Now let's take on d6. We have two pieces pointing towards his king. I need to get my king out the center of the board pretty quickly though, because the rook is on the same line as my king, so I have to be careful. If he tries to take on d5, my bishop is just going to take back. Bishop to d2, however, is a very nice move. I think he's trying to put his rook on d1. I am thinking of playing knight to f4 to apply some pressure to his bishop, but then he's just going to go bishop to f1. So first, let me get my king out the center of the board. That's very important. And then once he plays rook to c1, putting his rook on the same line as my queen, I'm just going to move my queen away. And keep in mind, there's no Greek gift happening here. The Greek gift sacrifice does not work if the opponent is able to protect the h7 square with a minor piece. So, okay, knight takes was played. I'm not going to play pawn takes because that blocks my bishop out. So let's take with the bishop. If he takes, knight check, king back, queen to h5, then knight to f6 just wins the game, which is why he plays queen c2. He's still deciding to apply a lot of pressure to my h6 pawn. Now, I'm not going to lie. I want to take on f3. Like, I want to take on f3, allow him to take on h7, move my king, and then once he takes back on f3, I play pawn g6 and then trap his bishop. And if he takes my pawn, I take his bishop. And if he takes my pawn again, rook to g8 wins the queen. It's a nice idea. Let's go for it. So let's take on f3, giving up my bishop for a knight. Okay, he saw it. He saw it, which is why he didn't take. And the good thing is, though, his king is exposed. If I take on d4 now, he takes on h7. I move my king. He pulls the bishop back, and I'm not really getting much. So I think I'm going to play maybe g6 or h6. His d4 pawn is always going to be a weakness, but he has the bishop here, so still need to be a bit careful. Let's just play h6. I'm very safe with h6. There's not going to be any sacrificial ideas with h6. He needs to ensure that he keeps his d4 pawn guarded. And because his king is so exposed, I could start an attack on his king. Queen to c6, surprisingly, should not work. Because now I'm able to take on d4. I'm attacking his unprotected bishop. He thinks he's attacking my unprotected bishop, but that would actually lose the queen, which he took on d7 thinking, okay, I'm going to take his knight. He's going to take my bishop. But that's not what I'm going to do, bro, because the queen is an unprotected piece. So we're about to hit him with a discovered attack. Bishop to h7. Check. The king now has to take or react to the check. We're just going to grab the queen and we're just going to win the game. The opponent resigns, but more Sicilian defense against 1600 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 1600. Let's go Sicilian. Knight f3, we play e6. This is the Sicilian Khan. And my opponent is actually playing the Alapin variation of the Sicilian, which is a very aggressive way to play. We're still going to be playing with our regular setup. Let's just play pawn to a6. And then after pawn d4, we're just going to be taking on d4. And then after they take, we play queen c7. So this could be played against anything that white plays once they play e4. We're just going to be playing the Sicilian. We move the two pawns, put the queen on c7, and then we develop our pieces normally. So the only thing that we need to be aware of is there's some early pawn to e5 that we need to be aware of, basically. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to be focusing more on developing like this. I'm going to play pawn to b5 with the idea of playing bishop to b7 and apply a lot of pressure to this e4 pawn. So for example, once my bishop is on b7 and I'm targeting e4, pawn to b4 chasing away the knight will become an idea, which is why he plays pawn a3. You're going to see a lot of players playing pawn to a3. By the way, it also prevents my bishop from going to the b4 square, but let's just play bishop to b7. We're still going to be applying some pressure to e4 nonetheless, and our plan is just to develop our pieces very normally here. And pawn to b4 is still a plan, by the way, because if I play pawn b4, hit the knight, then once I takes, I'm still threatening to apply a lot of pressure to this knight. So bishop to d3 was played. I'm thinking of playing knight to f6, pawn to e5. I think I need to play pawn to d6 before I play pawn to e5. Because one thing that we need to keep in mind is them playing pawn to e5 could be a bit annoying. to be honest. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play pawn to d6. The thing with this pawn to d6 though is the queen is now no longer applying a lot of pressure to this h2 pawn, which means once they castle the king, we can't really do the very fun knight f6, knight g4 ideas and then capture on h2. So the opponent decides to castle. I'm going to play knight d7, knight c6. I think they're both fine. I'm going to choose to play knight d7 before playing knight to f6. And again, the only reason why I'm doing all of this is so that way once I play knight f6, I don't have to worry about this pawn coming to e5. Because if the pawn goes to e5, I'm going to be able to take the pawn and it's going to be a free pawn. Which is why he plays bishop to f4. I guess he just really wants to play pawn to e5. So let's just develop the knight normally. If he plays e5, I'm just going to take. If he takes with the bishop at the end, I have bishop to d6. Rook to e1 was played. Let me just develop my bishop. From here, I'm trying to get my king out the center. Pawn h3 was played. Let's get the king out the center of the board. This is going to be more of a positional game. Rook to c1 was played. The rook is on the same line as my queen. We know what happens when the rook is on the same line as the queen. So we're not necessarily going to be thinking about it too much. We're just going to be moving the queen off the same line as the rook. And then from here, I'm just going to try to get my a rook on the c file and just continue to improve the rest of my pieces. Queen to e7, my opponent is actually playing very principled. He's ensuring that he's moving all the pieces. So I want to ensure that I'm playing principled as well. So let's go rook to c8, putting my rook on this file. All my pieces are developed. Every piece is doing something except my rook on f8. So I'm also thinking of just doubling the rooks on the c file. Hmm. Now pawn to e5 was played. Okay, once pawn to e5 is played, we definitely have to take on e5. I'm not afraid of him taking with the pawn, to be honest, because my knight will get access to this d5 square, hitting the bishop, hitting the knight, which means he has to trade. My bishop is sitting on this very long diagonal pointing towards his king. His bishop on d3 is also pointing towards my king as well. But let's just go knight to d5 here. There's never going to be any Greek gift sacrifice, seeing that my bishop is on e7. So if he sack and I take and he check, I'm just going to take and I'm winning. So he decided to trade. We're not going to take with the pawn because that's just an isolated pawn. So let's take with the bishop. And then one other idea that I want you guys to keep in mind is my queen could also come back to b7. And then my queen and my bishop is going to be working together, pointing towards that diagonal, pointing towards the opponent's king. I also want to play moves like knight c5, hitting the knight b3, hitting the rook. Bishop to e4 was played. That's not a bad move. I mean, he's trying to get rid of my strong bishop, and I'm not really seeing any way I have to like protect the bishop. I mean, I could try bishop to c5, but he's just gonna move. So let's just take on e4 here. And then my whole idea is once the queen takes, I'm able to play the move knight c5, gaining a tempo on the queen. And then once the queen move, I'm gonna play rook f to d8, and then all my pieces are gonna be doing something. Okay, but then he decides to play queen to e3. I guess he thinks he's pinning my knight to my queen, which he is, because now if I move the knight to like some random squares, he's going to be able to take my knight. So before I play a move like rook to d8, I'm going to play pawn to b4 because he may want to play pawn b4 to apply pressure to my pinned knight, even though I wouldn't lose any material. But if he takes on b4 and then I take on b4, his b2 pawn is now under attack. So he's the one who has to be careful here. Rook to c2 was played. That's an interesting defensive move. I mean, he guards the pawn. The rook is unprotected. I'm thinking of playing rook to d8 just to swing my last piece in the game. Like, I don't see an issue with that move. Yeah, let's go rook to d8. No, I could confidently say all my pieces are in the game. I'm not gonna lie though, like I want to play a move like knight to d3 because it would mean I'm forking his rook and his bishop on f4, but then he plays rook to c1. So here I have to be a bit careful. He has one, two, three pieces attacking my knight. I have one, two, three pieces protecting the knight. So I'm not about to lose a piece. Because he has so many attacking pieces, if I move my knight, I'm going to be losing a rook. So what I'm going to be doing instead is, well, I'm thinking of rook to d3. If rook d3, what if he takes my rook and then I take his queen and he takes another rook? That's very interesting. The thing is though, if I move my rook to b1, then he's still going to be taking my knight. Also very interesting. So let me just play rook to d5. Let me just apply some more defense to my knight. Let's just stay cautious. And then I could try to play rook c to d8, just doubling up on the d file. So that way I'm going to be free to move my knight from c5. I mean, this guy's playing some good chess. I'm not ahead by a pawn. I'm ahead on the clock, but I'm not really seeing any huge advantage that I have. I don't think his bishop on f4 is the best placed piece though, but he is applying a lot of pressure to my c file. Queen back to e2. The guy just played queen back to e2. It's like every time I give someone a compliment on how well they're playing, they just decide to blunder. This is called a drawback blunder, by the way. It's all about what was the piece doing that it's no longer doing. So he pulls the queen back to e2, not seeing that the queen was the only piece guarding the bishop. No, I just need to take this free bishop. And the good thing is, I know how the drawback principle works. Even though my queen is guarding my knight, once I take on f4, I'm ahead by a piece. My knight is actually adequately guarded. I'm actually guarding my knight 3 times. He's only attacking it twice. So I'm not about to lose anything. This is how people usually blunder, to be honest. I really want you guys to notice how you don't necessarily have to do much. It's all about getting out of the opening safely. Try your best to improve your position while not blundering. And people are just going to be blundering against you. The guy's 1694, damn near 1700. On to g3, he decides to attack my queen. I mean, I'm just going to move my queen here, to be honest. It doesn't really matter where I put the queen. I could put the queen back on g4. I could also let's just pull the queen back to f5. Because pulling the queen back to f5, there's not a lot of additional ways in which, oh my God, I'm so stupid, yo. I just gave an entire lecture about the drawback principle, and then I moved my queen away from guarding the b4 square. Now he's able to play pawn to b4. Oh, um, that was embarrassing. That was embarrassing. I just needed to play queen b4. I just needed to play queen b4. Now he plays pawn b4, and I'm gonna lose the knight. All right, let's try to be a bit creative here. Let's try to be creative. I'm about to lose a piece. It's fine. If I move the knight, I'm gonna lose. So I'm gonna play the move rook to d3. This is just a counter-attacking move, by the way. Like he just needs to move his knight. I'm just trying to get creative. His h3 pawn is also hanging. I think once he plays knight back to e1, that's just very, very strong for him. If knight e1, I may play rook to d8, and then if he takes my rook, I take his knight, and then I'm gonna have two minor pieces. He's gonna have a rook. Then it's just gonna be a slight advantage. So okay, he pulls the knight back to h2, which is also fine. He literally doesn't need to do anything. He just needs to take my knight on the next move. So embarrassing. Okay, what if I pull the rook back to d5? And then yeah, let's do that. Let's pull the rook back to d5. If he puts the knight on f3, then it's gonna be okay. He's trying to play for a draw, and then I'm not gonna repeat the position. But once he takes, then I'm gonna take. So now I'm only ahead by 1 pawn. I'm attacking the queen though. The queen has to move, which means his h3 pawn could be possibly hanging. Did not move the queen. Well, he did move the queen, but he took another pawn, which means I'm not ahead by a pawn anymore, and he's attacking my unprotected rook. So what am I gonna play here? I'm thinking of playing just rook takes e5. If he takes, then I takes, and then anytime he checks, I just block. So let's just take on c5 here. C5, h3 is still hanging. Let's just take again. Anytime he tries to check me, I'm just gonna block. He took, let's just take, and I'm only ahead by 1 pawn, but luckily he has no time on the clock because that's an embarrassing blunder. Let's block the check, and now I'm gonna try to win this game by moving my pawns up the board. So let's play h5 to prevent his knight from coming here. And now okay, here's how I'm gonna win this game. I mean, I'm gonna win on time regardless, but I'm gonna take on h5, and then I'm gonna play queen to d5 check. Queen to d5 check, his queen has to take. Now I have a pass pawn. And then he's basically trying to attack my pawn. So I'm going to put my bishop on c5, applying some pressure to his pawn, preventing his king from easily getting access to my pawn. And then I'm going to try to get my king in the game. So he moves his knight. I'm not able to play king f8 because of this fork. So let's play pawn to f6, hit the knight. He moves the knight to attack my bishop. Um, okay, now I'm actually gonna play bishop to d4, so that way it's not really easy for him to pull back the knight. I know he has to try something like knight to b8, so I'm gonna use the time to get my king in the game, trying to attack his knight. If he moves his king to attack my bishop, then he's gonna lose his pawn. But now I'm able to play king to e6 first, attack the knight, The knight has to go to b8. Then I'm going to go king to f5 and then attack the pawn. Now, okay, that's also losing because I'm just ahead by a pawn. So he should not be trading if I'm ahead by a pawn. Now I'm going to play king to e6 and then I'm going to play pawn g6. None of his pawns are able to move. He sacked the pawn, but the guy has 0 seconds on the clock. With that being said, more Sicilian defense against 1,700 players. Please stick around. Oh, guys, just pre-moving. It's still pre-moving. Okay, stick around. Our opponent is now 1,700. We're still playing the Sicilian can. Knight c3 was played. This is like some anti-Sicilian type of stuff where they don't want to play knight f3 pawn d4, but I'm still going to play the move pawn to e6. As we said, the version of the can that I'm playing, it can be played against whatever type of e4 they want to play. So I'm still going to play e6 next, and I'm still going to go queen c7. Now pawn to g3 was played, which means once the queen goes to c7, it does not attack the h2 pawn, but there's still some very nice ways to attack. So I'm going to be showing you guys. Let's start by playing pawn to a6, just keeping it in the spirit of what we're trying to do. And then after the bishop goes to g2, we play queen c7. We know what's happening here. And then after they play d3, I'm thinking of playing pawn to b5 here. Bishop to f4 is something that we're never going to be afraid of. But let me just develop my knight to c6 normally. There's not a lot of tension that is happening right now. So we just need to focus on our development. He decides to play knight e2. That's a sign that he is trying to castle on the king side. And the very interesting idea that I wanted to show you guys whenever someone plays g3 is to play pawn to h5. So we're still going to be playing pawn to h5 anyways. Now that he plays pawn to h4, you could say he's about to weaken his king. Just a bit. He's weakening his king a bit. So let's put the knight on f6, which means once my knight gets to the g4 square, there's no pawn to h3 to attack the knight. There will be pawn to f3 to attack the knight, but that's going to be weakening the king even more. Bishop to g5, not bad. I guess he's trying to double up my pawns here. Let's just play bishop e7, regular development moves. I'm developing a lot of my pieces. He moved his queen to d2. That's definitely a sign that he wants to castle on the queen side. And I'm just going to play pawn to b5 here with the regular idea. I'm trying to put my bishop on b7, and then all my pieces are going to get castled. Now, if you're not 100% sure if do I keep my king in the center? Do I castle on the king side? Do I castle on the queen side? Like, one thing you could do is try to finish your development first, which means get your queen out, get your bishop out, get your knights out, and then based on the position that you're seeing in front of you, then it's going to be easier for you to decide. Okay, now he plays pawn to f4, which means once my knight gets to the g4 square, he's not going to be able to ever getting my knight out of g4. I think he wants to play e5 though to attack my knight, which is fine. Let's just continue with our development. If he plays pawn e5, my knight gets the g4 square. And if the bishop takes, I'm just going to take. So I could also play king takes, by the way, because as we said, because of these pawns that is in front of our king could still be safe once it stays in the center of the board. Whoa. Actually, wasn't expecting him to castle on the king side. Like, he decides to castle on the king side after moving all the pawns on the side that his king is on. Now, I'm not even trying to castle on the king side because I moved the h pawn. Pawn e5 is usually thematic in the can, but we don't want to allow a knight coming to d5. I'm thinking of playing pawn b4, just to chase away his knight. And one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is if you're able to play pawn d5 in almost any Sicilian, if you're safely able to play pawn d5, then a lot of times, you're actually having an advantage. So I'm thinking of b4, but then he's just going to put his knight on a4. And I'm not really seeing what that gets me. Unless I really want to play pawn to d5. And then if he plays pawn to e5, I play knight to g4. Yeah, let's go for that. Let's play pawn to b4, hit the knight. If the knight goes to b4, it's on the edge of the board and my c5 pawn is guarded, which is why he pulls the knight back to d1. But now I play pawn to d5 and I just have very good control over the center of the board. Pawn to e5 was what I was expecting. But as we said, once the pawn goes to e5, the knight gets the g4 square. Very strong square for a knight, by the way. And oh my lord, he did not trade the bishops. I was just about to say he has to trade the bishops, but he didn't trade the bishops, which means He's about to lose a bishop. He basically just trapped his own bishop. Because once I play f6, the bishop is trapped. So I'm actually thinking, do I take the knight first, then play f6, or do I play f6? If I take a knight, he takes a bishop, I take a rook, hit the queen. And then if he takes my knight, I take his bishop. And am I ahead by a rook? Maybe. If I take the knight, he takes with the queen, then I play f6, takes, bishop takes, and then if I takes, there's queen takes c5. Hmm. Okay, let's just play f6. Let's just play f6. A piece is a piece. No need to overcomplicate stuff. Even though if I'm trying not to complicate stuff, I should be trading pieces off the board. If he plays bishop takes d5, I'm going to be very surprised. Because after takes knight takes, it hits my queen and my bishop, but it doesn't work. If he plays bishop d5, I'm just going to take his knight. So he will be losing a bishop. And we're 14 moves into the Sicilian can, and we're already winning a piece. Let's take on f6 here. The bishop has nowhere to go. He took, let's just take back. Still going to be taking the bishop on the next move. And keep in mind, my king is safe in the center, but because there's some drama happening on the king side, I'm planning on moving it to the queen side. So he decides to put the bishop on h6. Let's just grab the free bishop. I think he did that because he wants to play pawn to f5 and attack my rook. So now I have to move my rook, and then he's going to take on e6. So you could say he gets something for losing his bishop. But let's just pull the rook back. I'm thinking, let's just pull it back to h8 to avoid any complications. And then once he takes, his bishop is going to be attacking my pawn on d5. So I just need to not lose my d pawn and I should be fine. Knight f4 is also very interesting. Let's see what he plays. If knight f4, I may consider playing knight to d4. So he didn't do it. He decided to take. I mean, I still like the idea of knight d4 because the guy's attacking my pawn. I'm trying to castle. I mean, castling is also fine because the rook guards the pawn. Knight d4, there's knight f4. So let's just castle. Safety first. Safety first. Now that we're safe, I could consider if I want my knight on e5 or d4. And I'm ahead by a piece, which means I'm just chilling. If I'm able to play e5, play knight e5, trade the light squared bishops off the board, then I'm going to have a permanently placed knight on f3. So he plays a3, which is a natural move because he's trying to open lines on my king. So if I takes, there's rook takes, then I play pawn to d4, and then I continue with my plan. Yeah, let's do that. Let's take on a3. Slightly dangerous because the rook has a file pointing towards my king. But at the end of the day, I'm the one who is ahead by a piece, not him. So I could do whatever I want, to be honest. Oh, he took with the pawn. That was very slow, bro. That was very slow. Let's just play pawn to d4 here. The idea is to get the light squared bishops off the board. So once I play knight e5, after takes, then his f3 score is just going to be too weak. Rook to b1. That's a nice move. That's a nice move. Because now I'm not able to play knight e5 because I'm going to be losing my bishop. Okay, how do we navigate this? Okay, let's not rush it. Let's play bishop to d6. That's two pieces attacking his g3 pawn. I just need to be aware of any sacrificial ideas. For example, if he takes on b7, I just take with the queen. My queen is going to be the only defender of my knight. And I can also just play knight a5 and just get the bishops off the board this way. But I actually wanted my knight on the f3 square, so it's a bit tricky. Now he's trying to play knight to d5. I'm ahead by a piece, so without thinking about it, I should be trading. But then he has rook takes. Let's say I play knight here. Knight here, knight here. I takes, bishop takes. Okay, let's just get rid of the knight. It's a bit weird. It's a bit weird. Rook takes attacks this. Knight a5, I'm trying to trade. If bishop takes, I play knight takes. Rook takes is not as strong as it looks because his g3 pawn is going to be hanging. So it's a bit iffy, but let's see what happens. Pawn to e7, definitely did not consider that move. It's a very nice try because if I take the pawn, he's going to take my knight. He's trying to do, I think this is called deflection, but let's just play rook to e8 here. And I'm going to try to take the pawn with my rook. So if he doesn't do anything, I'm just going to be trading. The more pieces I trade off the board, the lesser his attack is going to be looking. So he traded bishops. That's good for me. Let's just take with the knight. I'm also defending my king. Rook takes f6 was played, but we spoke about this. The moment the rook moves away, my queen gets access to taking on g3 with check. Now, I thought he was gonna block with the queen. He chose to get checkmated instead, because moving the king to h1 is just mate. This is mating too, because once I take with check, the king has to block, which is why he resigned. But more Sicilian defense against 1800 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 1800. Plays e4. Let's play pawn c5. This is the Sicilian defense. The plan is to play the Sicilian Khan. Usually the players at the high ratings play knight f3 followed by d4. Sometimes you're going to be able to see pawn c3. He plays knight to f3, and now we're going to be playing the move pawn to e6. And as we said, the stronger players usually play like this. But whenever you see a pawn goes to d4, we always take on d4. The knight takes back on d4. Now we play the thematic pawn to a6. Now, pawn c4 is actually interesting because it prevents us from playing immediate pawn to b5. I'm going to be showing you guys how I would navigate this, but let's just play the move queen to c7 here. We know about the idea of applying a lot of pressure to that h2 pawn. So let's see how the opponent plays against this. Knight c3 was played. Okay, the opponent is developing. I'm also going to be developing as well. Knight f6, developing my pawn, applying some pressure to the e4 pawn. He plays bishop to d3, guarding the pawn. And from here, I'm going to play the move bishop to c5. It doesn't necessarily gain a tempo on the knight, by the way, because if they play knight to b3, which he did, he basically regained the tempo on my bishop. But I basically actually just didn't want his knight in the center of the board. So now that I'm able to get his knight out of the center of the board, now I'm just going to pull my bishop back to e7. Sometimes pulling the bishop back to a7 is also good because you keep the bishop on this diagonal pointing towards f2. But now he decides to play h3. I guess he doesn't want my knight going to the g4 square. But let's just continue by playing knight to c6 for now. I'm not able to play b5. I'm thinking of playing b6 though, because we're still trying to prioritize our development. So pawn b6, bishop b7, and maybe I could still play h5 followed by knight g4, because if he takes and I takes, he's gonna be getting checkmated on h2. So he castles the king. Let's play pawn to b6 first. Let's get all our pieces developed. Not really trying to rush. Bishop to e3 was played. He's just developing his bishop. And okay, knight to a4 looks like it could be a threat. For example, bishop b7, knight a4, it does apply some pressure to my b6 pawn. With that being said, we have to choose to be aggressive here. Let's play the move knight e5. Let's apply some pressure to his bishop on d3. But I'm also attacking this pawn twice on c4. And in some cases, I should be able to just put my bishop on c5 if I'm really trying to defend my b6 pawn. My bishop could still move to b7. So, I mean, black is still in good shape here. Okay, but then he decides to play bishop to f4. Like, that's not a move I was expecting, to be honest. I mean, it is pinning my knight to my queen. I'm not really seeing any ways in which he could apply pressure to my pinned knight. So let's just play the move bishop to b7 first, putting my bishop on this very long diagonal. If this pin ever becomes a threat, by the way, we can always play bishop d6 and we can always play pawn d6. So putting the bishop to f4 was in fact an inaccurate move. Now he pulls the knight back to f3. I think what he's trying to do is apply pressure to my pin knight. No, it's not a free bishop, by the way, because if I take the bishop, he's going to take my queen. So what I'm going to do is, now I'm going to play bishop to d6. Now I'm threatening to take a free bishop. And he has to be very careful here. Actually in trouble here, by the way. I think he's about to lose one of his bishops. Like, I'm not going to win the bishop, but he may have to trade a bishop for a knight in this position. So he did give up his bishop for a knight. Let's take the bishop. Now we have two very strong bishops pointing towards his king. Now that he plays pawn to f4, the game could get very interesting here. For example, he is exposing this diagonal pointing towards his king. It's also a free pawn, by the way. Like, I was thinking of playing moves like bishop to d4 check, and then once the king moves, pawn h5, knight g5, threaten this, and then if he takes, I take on g4, and then he gets mate. But taking on f4 is just a free pawn. I'm not gonna lie. Apart from like the aggressive white openings that I play, this is actually one of the only black openings that I play where the players at the higher level, is not really challenging me because, I'm playing with the black pieces and I start to attack them the moment the game begins. And if you look on my king, you could debate that I'm breaking principles, just not getting my king out the center of the board. But I already told you guys that once the pawns look like this, there's no way for them to get to my king. And if I really need to castle my king, I could still decide where I'm planning on putting it. So knight to f3 was played. I'm still going to be going for my very aggressive idea, which is pawn to h5, because I want to be able to get my knight to the g4 square in the future. And we already know that once the knight gets to g4, if they ever try to take, just the fact that my rook joins the attack makes it very hard for them. So for example, knight back to e2 was played. My bishop is under attack. First of all, that's a drawback mistake because he had two pieces guarding the pawn on e4. I have two pieces attacking the pawn on e4. So moving the knight to e2, that's already just a pawn. But my bishop is under attack. So first I'm going to play the move bishop to e3, checking the king. And then once he moves the king, that's when I'm going to be taking on e4. And now he still has to be very careful, still threatening to play knight f2, which is a fork. So it is going to be winning his rook. So I'm assuming he's going to be giving up another bishop for a knight, which means I'm going to have two monster sniper bishops just pointing towards his king. And by the way, I'm probably not going to do this in this game, but there is ideas of pawn g5 followed by pawn g4. So he took, let's just take back, both of my bishops are unprotected, by the way. Like, I like to ensure that you guys understand that whenever I have unprotected pieces, I try to be a bit more aware of this because a lot of persons, they have unprotected pieces and then they just leave the pieces unprotected and then that's how they fall for tactics. But the good thing is there's not really any ways in which the opponent could try to attack both of these bishops at the same time. Like he could try to attack one, but not both of them at the same time. So pawn to b3 was played. He's trying to guard his pawn. I'm thinking of going for the pawn g5 followed by pawn g4 idea here, actually. Yeah, like that's just super aggressive, to be honest. Yeah, let's go for it. Let's go pawn g5. Like once I play pawn g4, if he takes, he gets mate. If he doesn't take, I take. And just the fact that my bishop is on the same line as his king, he's going to be in trouble. So knight c3 attacks my bishop. Let's just pull the bishop all the way back to b7. So that way I only have one unprotected bishop. And if he decides to attack the bishop, I just pull the bishop back to c5. And the moment I just feel or sense that my king may be in any danger at all, or I may need to bring this rook in the game, I'm just going to castle on the queen side, swing the rook over to g8, and then like both of the rooks are just going to be in the attack. So queen to d3 attacks my bishop. Yes, my bishop is guarding g5, but I don't really mind the drawback principle because I think I kind of want him to take on g5, to be honest. Like, I mean, there is bishop to f5, but do I want him to take on g5? Let's look on it. Bishop c5, knight takes g5, he's threatening f7. Let's say I play pawn to f5. Once I play pawn to f5, the plan from there is going to be to castle and play rook g8, and that's going to be very threatening. There is also bishop f4. Bishop f4, there's knight e2, which attacks the bishop. Pawn g4 hits the knight. If he takes my bishop, yeah, that's also very aggressive. Let's go with bishop to f4. I like the idea of bishop c5, but let's just go with bishop to f4. I'm trying to play pawn to g4 with tempo, and I'm also trying to castle my king, so that way my rook could go on the g file and join the attack. Pawn to h5 cannot be good. Isn't this what I want? Okay, if I take, there's knight takes, my bishop is kind of under attack. Let me get my king out the center of the board first. Let's be principled for 1 second, so that way this rook could go to g8. So now if he takes, I play rook g8, or I could even play h4 followed by h3, so that way my rook that is on the same line as the king could attack. I want you guys to notice how my bishop is on the same line as the king, my rook is on the same line as the king. There has to be some tactical stuff happening here. So now that he took the pawn, I have two options. Do I go rook g8 trying to take the pawn this way? Or do I immediately hit him with pawn to h4? So that way, once I play pawn h3, if he takes, it opens up my bishop and my rook at the same time. If he does not take, then I take. So pawn to g3 really didn't do anything. Let's just play pawn to h3. If he takes, I takes, and then everything is now just open. And he will be getting checkmate. Okay, he plays pawn g4. That's an understandable move. He's not trying to open any lines. I'm thinking of just pawn f5 here, but he's just gonna take. His knight is now pinned though. So okay, let's just take on g6, knowing that he's not able to play queen takes. Because if he plays queen takes, then my rook goes to g8 and I'm winning the pawn on g4. He also only has 50 seconds on the clock. Like, I want to show you guys how this game is gonna end, but the guy just does not have any time on the clock. Knight to e4 was played. He's trying to say, okay, I do not want your bishop to be too active, so I'm going to be putting the knight in the way. Now, because he plays that move, now I'm going to play the move queen to c6. I'm now attacking his knight twice. My queen is also on the same line as the king. He plays rook to e1 to guard the knight, which means this knight on f3 becomes a bit weaker. So because my rook on d8 is not really doing anything, I'm going to play the move rook to f8. Now I could see all my pieces are pretty active and is doing something. I want to play moves like bishop to g3, attacking this knight on g3, attacking the rook, and if his knight takes, then I'm able to grab his knight. But then he decides to play the move knight to d4, which is not a bad move because it immediately attacks my queen. But now I'm able to play the move queen to d6, pinning the knight to the queen. And then you guys are probably saying, bro, you just blundered your queen. I did not blunder my queen because the knight on e4 is pinned, and pinned pieces does not protect. The funny thing is, this knight that is on d4, which is pinned to his queen, I'm planning on playing moves like bishop to e5 to apply pressure to his pinned knight, which is why he plays rook to e1. But I'm still thinking of doing it. Let's just play bishop back to e5, apply some pressure to the knight. I'm trying to just get rid of the knight and then swing my queen into the attack. He pulls the knight back to f3. It's not a bad move. And now I'm thinking, okay, he only has 2 seconds on the clock, so let's just take the queen. And then I'm going to play the move bishop to g3 and attack his rook. If this knight takes, my bishop takes, but he lost on time. So more Sicilian defense against 1900 players. Do stick around. Our opponent is now 1900. He plays e4. We're hitting him with a Sicilian defense. Knight f3, we play pawn to e6 because we're going for the aggressive Sicilian can. Pawn d4, the stronger players are going to be playing like this. Let's take on d4. And then once the knight takes, we want to play queen c7, but we don't want to allow knight b5, which is why we play pawn to a6. Keep that in mind. Knight c3, we put the queen on c7. This is called the can variation of the Sicilian defense. A lot of ideas that I've been explaining to you guys. That's basically the purpose of the queen. And bishop to e3 is actually an inaccurate move. And a lot of strong players make this inaccurate move because a lot of times they actually need to have the bishop on d2 to defend whenever we play bishop b4 and apply pressure to the knight. But what I like to do is I like to play knight to f6 first, so that way I'm just already applying pressure to the e4 pawn. So that way, the moment I hit him with bishop to b4, it really starts hurting. So for example, the two natural moves, bishop to e2 and queen d2, is actually just not good. Pawn to f3 was played. And okay, now we're going to play bishop e4. We have two pieces attacking the knight on c3. He only has one piece guarding the knight, which means we're already threatening to win a pawn. As I told you guys, I'm not lying when I say you could actually start a very principled attack coming out of the opening. And the reason why it sounds like a scam, it actually sounds like a scam because for one, you're playing with the black pieces, and two, playing with the black pieces, you shouldn't be attacking, you should be defending. Queen to d2 is also one of the, like, I think he's about to like fall into a trap if I'm not wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, but all I'm going to do here is play pawn to d5. Why pawn to d5, you may ask? I'm applying more pressure to his pawn on e4. Like, black is actually better here because if he plays pawn to e3, it's just a removing the guard tactic, and I'm winning the pawn on e4. Pawn to e5 is not good, and bishop to d3 loses a piece. Like, I'm not making this up. Welcome to the Sicilian camp. So pawn a3 was what he chose to play. And by the way, if he had played bishop d3, I would have played pawn e5, hit the knight, and then once the knight move, I play pawn d4, and that's a fuck. So he chose to lose a pawn. Let's just take on c3. It's just a removing the guard tactic. I'm assuming he's going to take with the queen and go into an endgame, which he didn't. So let's just take the free pawn on e4. We're 10 moves into the Sicilian can. We're already ahead by a pawn, and we did not break any principles to win this pawn. Maybe you're going to say that I developed my queen too early, but it was actually a development move. It's not like I put my queen on the other side of the board or anything. And the funny thing is, he's not even able to take on e4 because once I take, I hit the queen. So he decides to play the move pawn to f4. Okay, now I'm thinking about breaking some principles, which is knight d5. And I mean, I like knight d5 because it applies more pressure to his c3 pawn and it attacks his bishop. If I play knight d5, there is pawn c4 though. And then I takes, queen takes, and I mean, he's losing, but he's slightly fine. So I think this is one of those lines where I just need to be satisfied with what I have and just get my king out the center of the board. And you're not always going to be castling on the king side a lot. You just have to understand where the opponent's pieces are pointing, where your pieces are pointing to know where you need to castle. In this case, we're going to be castling on the king side because I'm trying to get a rook on the d5 as quickly as possible. Bishop e2 looks like he's also trying to get castle. Rook to d1. Okay, rook d1 doesn't really threaten anything because the knight is guarded. Knight c6 puts some pressure on the knight, doesn't do too much. So let's just play pawn to b5. Very, very thematic. You guys have seen me play pawn b5 a million times, but why pawn b5? I'm actually trying to play knight d5. That's actually the move that I'm trying to play. But if I play knight d5, he could have played pawn c4. Now there's no pawn c4. So once I hit him with knight d5, I'm not only applying pressure to his bishop, I'm attacking the weak doubled c3 pawn twice. The question is, how is he going to apply or how is he going to add more defense to his weak c3 pawn? I'm not seeing it. Maybe he's going to be down by another pawn. Let's see though. Hmm. Pawn to f5 is a very interesting move. I guess he thinks if I take the pawn, he's going to take my pawn. But I mean, we're patient. Like, let's say I take on f5. If I take on f5 and he takes with the knight, I takes, rook takes, you could say that is helping my development. But do I really want to give up my bishop for a knight? That's how I'm thinking about it. What if I play pawn to e5 and attack his knight? If I hit the knight, okay, he takes on b5. And if I takes, there's queen takes. Hmm. What if I play queen takes though? Just get the queens off the board. I'm ahead by what? 2 pawns? And if queen takes, I take. This is gonna be hanging. If he takes, I play bishop takes. And if knight takes, I take with check. It's just winning. I'm not gonna lie though. I'm thinking of takes, knight takes, 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 knight takes. Nah, that's weird. A pawn is a pawn at the end of the day. Let's just take the free pawn. We're now ahead by 2 pawns. We're just getting the queens off the board, seeing that we're ahead by a pawn. I'm also attacking his bishop twice. So he has to either move the bishop or trade the queens. I'm assuming he's going to trade the queens because moving the bishop could also lose a piece. So once he trades, e2 bishop is under attack. Only downside of my position is I need to hurry up and get my knight on b8 and my bishop on c8 developed. He took, let's take, we're applying a lot of pressure here. He plays bishop to f5, and I'm ahead by 2 pawns. We're just trying to trade pieces off the board. So let's just take on f5 here. If he takes with the bishop, we just trade pieces off the board, helping me to finish my development, being ahead by 2 pawns. What more can I ask for? So bishop takes f5 was played. Now, this bishop has not yet moved. This bishop already moved 1, 2, 3 times, which means once I take that bishop, I'm gaining some time on him. Now, knight takes was played, and I need to be careful. As we said, I'm not completely developed, so I need to stop what I'm doing, get my knight off the back rank. So there's no checks here. Bishop c5 hits the rook, but then I'm just going to move it. Both of my knights are unprotected pieces, so I have to be careful. You notice whenever I see myself with unprotected pieces, I try to be more aware of it. And that's why it's harder for me to fall for tactics. The reason why you fall for simple tactics is because whenever there's an unprotected piece in the position, it just slips you. For example, like this, knight e4 is actually complete losing. And the reason why knight e4 is losing is because once I take the knight, which is a no-brainer because I'm ahead by 2 pawns, why wouldn't I trade? The bishop takes becomes an unprotected piece. And then I'm able to hit him with knight e2 check. He's going to be forced to move the king. And then I'm going to be grabbing the bishop. And that's going to be GG's. Now, being someone at 1900, he's probably going to resign. Let's give a check on e2. And the Sicilian can strikes again. The opponent resigns. More Sicilian can against 2,000 rated players. Stick around. Our opponent is now 2,000. He plays e4. Let's hit him with a Sicilian defense. Knight f3, we're going to be playing pawn to e6 as we have been talking about. This is the Khan variation of the Sicilian. Once they play pawn d4, we take on d4 with the pawn. Always take on d4 once they play d4. And once the knight takes, we play pawn to a6. Why pawn to a6? We do not want the knight going to the b5 square because our queen is going to be enjoying the c7 square. What's the purpose of queen c7? It applies pressure to this knight on b4. It points towards this h7 square. Queen to f3 is actually one of the theoretical moves that white could play. So, we're playing at 2000. We're going to be seeing some good chess. Now, the purpose of queen to f3 is actually to play bishop to f4 to attack the queen. It's not like this huge threat though, so no need to be too alarmed. We're just going to be continuing with our regular development ideas. I'm going to choose to play the move pawn to b5 because I'm trying to play bishop to b7, putting the bishop on the same line as the queen. If he plays bishop to f4, by the way, just keep in mind that it's pawn to e5 is not necessarily a fork, because we're weakening the d5 square. The bishop is able to go back to g3. He decides to play the move bishop to d3, which appears to be a weird move because the queen no longer covers the knight. I'm thinking of bishop to b4 here to apply some pressure to the knight so that way it forces him to play bishop to b2, and then I just develop my pieces normally. So let's go with that idea. Remember when I told you guys that putting the queen on c7 is so that we were already applying pressure to the knight once he puts it on c3. That's basically the idea. So I'm assuming he's going to play a move like bishop to d2 here, but at least he doesn't get to play bishop to f4. And from here, we're going to play moves like knight f6, bishop b7, knight c6, regular Sicilian Khan stuff. We could decide if we want to castle. We could decide if we want to castle on the queen side. Sometimes we castle on the king side. Sometimes. So he did decide to play the move bishop to d2, and pawn to a3 is a move that I'm expecting like immediately after he plays bishop to d2. So here I'm thinking, do I play bishop to b7 or do I play knight c6? I'm going to choose to play bishop to b7 solely because it puts the bishop on the same diagonal as the queen. And, we know the different type of tactic that could happen if he puts the bishop on the same diagonal as the queen. Now, queen to g3 was played, that's not a bad move, by the way, because he's basically trying to exchange the queens off the board. And he's also attacking my g2 pawn, which means I think I kind of have to just trade the queens here. And then once he takes with the pawn, I'm going to play the move. Okay, knight f6. Yeah, let's just go with knight f6. We're still applying a lot of pressure to the e4 pawn. The good thing about this is we're playing with the black pieces. He's the one who is trying to force the queens off the board. His pawn on e4 is already under some attack. He could try to play pawn to e5 thinking he's forcing my knight to move more than once. But what he did not see is the fact that now once he plays pawn to e5, his pawn on g2 is under attack. Now, if I take the pawn on g2, then he's just going to move the rook and I'm probably going to be down by a piece. But the move that I'm going to play here is knight to g4 because now his pawn on e5 is hanging and this pawn on g2 is hanging. We're 11 moves into the Sicilian Khan, by the way. Are we going to already be ahead by a pawn? Okay, one more thing that I want to tell you guys is it looks like my pawn on h7 is hanging. It's never hanging because even if he trades and the bishop takes, pawn g6 just traps the bishop. So he decides to play the move bishop to e4. Makes some sense because the knight guards. If I try to take the knight, he takes my bishop. Then I take his bishop with check. He moves the king. I attack the bishop moves, I take the pawn. I'm just ahead by a pawn. That's one variation that I'm looking at. The other variation that I'm looking on is if I take the bishop, he takes my bishop. I takes with check. He takes with the king. I take the pawn. And then he plays knight to d6 with check. I'm not afraid of knight to d6 with check, though. That's the thing. Because if he plays knight d6 with check, king e7, we're in the endgame. He's helping me in the endgame. So either way, I'm going to be ahead by a pawn. So let's just take on e4. Knight takes e4, I'm expecting. Then we take on d2. If he takes with the knight, we take the pawn. If he takes with the king, we take the pawn. We're ahead by a pawn. Like 12 moves into the Khan. And knight d6, we were expecting. We knew it didn't do anything because once I play, let's say, king to e7 here, I'm already applying pressure to the knight. So is he gonna just play knight d6 check just so that way he could pull his knight back to e7? That's a weird move. Oh, he plays pawn to f4. He's trying to be aggressive, but that should not work. I'm already ahead by one pawn. If I take on d6, he takes on e4, I take on e5. I'm ahead by 2 pawns. And you're probably saying, why are you exposing your king like that? Bro, I'm in the end game. I'm trying to develop my king. Let's take the knight. If he takes my knight, I take his pawn. We're already 2 pawns up in the can. My king is perfectly developed and active, and I'm attacking his knight. So pawn to c3, kind of was expecting pawn c3. The only piece that I have that is not developed, that is not doing anything, is my knight on b8. So let's just play the move knight c6, developing my knight on c6. And I could confidently say this position is completely winning. White has no compensation. You're probably watching this saying, okay, bro, but your king is exposed. Bro, I'm in the end game. I want my king to be active. Okay, rook to h5 check. I see he's applying some pressure to my king. Now I'm thinking of just moving my king, but like, why wouldn't I play a move like pawn to f5? I mean, I block the check. Maybe he takes, then I takes. Tries to apply some pressure to my pawn, but it's already guarded. Let's just play pawn to f5. Plus, his pieces are also not coordinated properly. Knight back to f3 check. Now all I need to do is put my king back on f6, and he has nothing. Maybe he could try rook to h1, thinking, okay, I'm applying a lot of pressure to your pawn, which is something. But what if I play pawn to h6 though? Like, both of these rooks, what are they doing? They're just pointing towards my h6 pawn. Like, I'm just gonna move my rook out the way, and then both of these rooks aren't gonna be doing anything. I want to play knight e5 though. Like, I'm not gonna lie. If I'm able to like get the knights off the board, then it's really gonna be GG's. And I also want to get both of my rooks in the game. So he decides to play rook h4. Not a bad move. I think he wants to play pawn to g4, getting rid of his doubled pawns. Pawn to g5 does not help because of the drawback principle, not trying to hang my pawn. So what if I play knight e5 here? I prevent pawn g4. I try to trade the knights. If he trades the knight, then play pawn g4. I'm fine. I get the knights off the board. We're in the end game. We're trying to trade the pieces off the board. Let's hit him with knight to e5. He took, let's take again, very, very active king. And then he decides to play rook to d4. Decent move, by the way. And okay, I want to play rook to d8, but there's nothing stopping me from just playing pawn to d5. Again, my king is active. If he checks, I pull my king back to f6. I'm still going to play rook to d8, so he checks. We spoke about this. I'm going to play the move king to f6 because I want to play pawn to e5. I'm not able to play pawn to e5 just yet, though, because I'm going to lose this pawn. Okay, now that he plays pawn to g4, what if I play pawn to e5, allowing him to take this pawn, then play rook to d8 to attack his rook? Nah, that doesn't work. That does not work. Okay, if I take the pawn, he takes my pawn. So let's just play pawn g6, he takes, I takes. There's more pawn g4. Hmm. We can't be playing chess and our pieces are not doing anything. So let me just get my rook in the game. If he decides to take, I'm thinking of playing king takes and not pawn takes. It's a bit risky though. King takes, well, this rook is not able to check, and if he checks this way, I just move. So let's play king takes. I want to play pawn e5. That's the thing. I have a pass pawn and I have a pawn majority. And we know about endgames. So he pulls the rook back to d3. I think he wants to check on f3. If he checks on f3, then I'm going to be forced to move the king. He's going to take this pawn. So let's play rook to e8, just guarding both of my pawns. And then if he checks here, I just move the king, and then I'll start push the pawns up the board. So he checks. We have to move. This is 2 versus 1. This is called a pawn majority, by the way. So I need to ensure that I'm moving these pawns up the board, and I also need to ensure that I'm moving these pawns up the board. So him playing a move like rook to e5 was actually not too bad. If I could just get one of the rooks off the board, then that would be perfect. So let's play the move pawn to d4. Let's try to trade this pawn off the board so that way I'm able to play rook to d5. And just a general rule of thumb is whenever you're in the end game, you don't necessarily want to be trading the pawns. You want to be winning the pawns. But I'm just trading the pawns here because my rooks aren't really doing much. So once he takes and I takes, and then I check his king and his king move, I'm going to be able to play something like rook b5, which will chase away his rook because I'm not expecting him to trade. So he moves the king. Let's take the pawn, and he decided to take with the pawn. No, I'm going to play rook to d5. And again, I'm not expecting him to take because he's down by 2 pawns. I'm expecting him to like maybe pull his rook back somewhere. But now his pawn on c3 becomes a weak pawn. So now we have another target to attack. So he decides to play rook e4. I want to move my pawn. Let's play pawn to e5 here. If he checks, I go back. So he checks. Let's, oh, there's rook f7. Rook f7 is actually very strong. I did not want him to play that move because now I have to play rook to g8. I needed to defend my 7th rank first. Now it's actually going to be a bit harder because I'm going to have to try to wriggle myself out of this. So now he plays rook to e4. I'm going to play rook to c5. Basically, if he tries to win my e pawn, I'm going to try to win his c pawn. But because his rook is on my 7th rank, it's kind of weird and awkward. But he's not going to be able to like win anything or draw. And I have a minute 30 on the clock, so I have to be very fast. So he decides to put his rook back on b4, which means he's basically saying I'm just not going to ever be able to move my rook. Let's play pawn to h5 though. Let's chase away this rook. And then once he moves, I play king to h6. As I said, I'm going to be slowly wriggling my way out of this. And if he pulls his, okay, he moves the rook to g3. This pawn is under attack. So let's play the move king to h6. Now I'm attacking his rook. Oh, rook to f5 is actually very strong, bro. If rook to f5, I have to play g6, hit the rook, and then he takes, and then okay, now I'm not ahead by 2 pawns anymore. But at least I get to trade a pair of pawns off the board. Well, a pair of rooks off the board. Now it's 2 versus 1. Let's play the move rook to f8. I'm trying to get to his second round. I'm not trying to mess up this endgame. I think he's going to play something like rook to e2, and then I'm going to play something like rook to f6, guarding my 6th rank. Like, the pawns are not on the second rank anymore. So let's play rook to f6, so that way his rook doesn't come up, and then we're going to be advancing our pawn majority. So I'm going to be able to win this game solely because of this 2 versus 1. So now he puts his rook here. What is stopping me from just attacking his... No, that doesn't work. Let's play h5. I'm trying to run my king around to g4. Like, this is endgame technique, by the way. Like, his rook move didn't really do much. Checking my king is only helping my king to get advanced and attack his pawn. So even though he's 2000, even players at the 2000 level still struggles with endgame technique. Now I play king to g4, and keep in mind, my intention was to trade the pawns, but if he allows me to win this pawn, it's over because now I have connected passed pawns. I'm not going to take and then allow him to take. I'm actually going to play rook to f5 because once I take this pawn, I have connected passed pawns and it's over. Let's take. Yes, he's going to take. Now I roll the pawns up the board and it's GG's. I'm not going to lie, like, he played the opening a bit bad, but the end game I played bad. But luckily I was ahead by 2 pawns. He moves the king, we queen the pawn, and now I'm just going to queen another pawn and win the game. So he pushed, let's just take, just turn the other pawn into a queen, simple stuff, grab the pawn, and now it's just a regular ladder checkmate. Let's check, king has to move, rook here, and that's a checkmate.